you a lover of all things cute and cuddly? Do you believe in making a difference in the lives of those who need it most? Kitten Rescue NW, a local kitten rescue based in San Antonio, Texas, run by a group of dedicated individuals who have poured their hearts and retirement savings into saving these precious little lives. But they can't do it alone. With overfilled fosters and a growing number of cats and kittens in need, they're reaching out for your help. From April 21st to May 4th, join us in our mission to raise funds for the Kitten Rescue. Your donation will go directly to supporting the construction of their new facility, providing a safe haven for these furry friends. Every dollar counts. Help support the rescue through ko-fi.com/kittenrescuenw, or you can always go directly to kittenrescuenw.org. Together, we can make a difference. And if you're looking to expand your family, Kitten Rescue Northwest offers adoptions to any city in the U.S. with Southwest Airlines access. These little furballs are ready to find their forever homes. So join the cause, stream, donate, adopt, and spread the word along with the night shift. Together, let's get these kittens the love and care they deserve. I, Dr. James Wesley, placed this testimony here as a record of the events leading up to the death. Leading up to the genocide of everyone that worked at the corporate office of Osset Pharmaceutical, found in Washington State. We were told that the work we were doing was going to help people. This started last spring. I got a call from the headmaster at Carbuncle Academy. I'd been studying medicine there for nearly 3 years and never once was asked his office, so the thought of being summoned actually terrified me. Marsh was as old as dirt and as stern as a brick wall. He smoked a pipe, wore clothes that looked like they belonged in the 1930s. As I entered his office, he played a vinyl record on an old player and let classical music fill the air. He told me to close the door and asked me if I was familiar with the piece, to which I admitted that I wasn't. According to him, the music was created by a local cult leader back in the 1880s named Abraham Zwain. The headmaster explained that Zwain had managed to convince hundreds in the area to kill themselves due to a meteor shower. If I might ask, why are you telling me this, sir? His bizarre ramblings about ritualistic genocide had left me unnerved, and I wasn't entirely sure what the purpose was of my arrival to his office. He puffed his pipe again and focused his old pale eyes on me before explaining that a rumor had spread across the academy campus that I was involved in extracurricular activities with questionable students. I didn't lie. I have no intention of concealing the truth from anyone that hears this tale. Full disclosure is necessary in order for guilt and blame to be placed where they belonged. When I arrived in Carbuncle Academy 3 years ago, one of my first interactions with the students was actually near the East Gate. Another student, a senior, had just plummeted from the rampart and smashed their skull all over the courtyard below. Dozens of students and teachers, they were trying to get a look at this grisly scene. One in particular, a young medical orderly named Herbert, told me that the student who had committed suicide, he had been involved in strange behavior surrounding a church that sat in the South Courts. I had always had an inquisitive mind, and it bothered me that someone with a bright future ahead of them would toss it all away after a single visit to an old religious institution. So I traveled there myself. According to others I met during my time here, many believed the church was not made by human hands. It had otherworldly feels about it, and people gathered there to express their interest in the unknown. The leader of these congregates was named Severn, Thomas Severn, and he greeted me like a sheep to be brought to slaughter. Considering how easily I was roped into this mess, that analogy proved true in many ways than one. Severn explained to me that the land around Carbuncle Academy was considered sacred by the local police, and of course, the immigrants that settled and took over and built the academic buildings had no interest in such superstitions, and plundered the land of their own benefit. The church, he claimed, was the only one remnant of the old world. I asked him about the strange rumors surrounding the church and the student that had committed suicide. He told me that there were star charts that some students studied here in the church that the teachers considered questionable. Apparently they showed systems that didn't match modern astrology, and therefore they were deemed inferior. The student that had jumped from the wall had somehow learned more about these charts, and that knowledge had caused him to end his life. I told all of this to Headmaster Marsh, explaining that ever since that encounter, I had dabbled in the esoteric, along Herbert and Severn. I had come to theorize that the charts, which had baffled so many, were actually not showing any stars we were familiar with at all, but rather from an age long past, when the skies were still luminous in the area. I also, I admitted to him, believed that the charts were created by visitors from the stars. Saying such things out loud made me feel foolish in front of such a learned man, but to my surprise, he only puffed his pipe and nodded in agreement. I had heard you were writing such papers under a pseudonym, trying to see if any of the other teachers in the academy agreed with you. As it turns out, there's a chapter of this school's history that has been covered up which relates to your own investigations. And that's where the story of Zwain comes in. Headmaster Marsh explained to me that the board of directors had agreed to keep the works of Zwain under lock and key almost 100 years ago. But over the past few generations, things got forgotten, and a few of the papers that the cult leader had written were able to leak. And the star charts in the books I had been studying at the church in secret were actually part of those papers. Are you saying there's truth to the ramblings of a fictional story where he claimed to have seen aliens? I asked. The story, which I can summarize, connected to the meteor shower that Marsh had already told me about. During the late 1800s, Zwain said that large, monolithic objects fell from the sky all across Dunwich County. He believed these objects were actually from the Earth's moon, and they revealed that these aliens were living amongst us. It had sounded insane when I studied it, but the papers had included detailed descriptions of the aliens and illustrations. The beings looked like massive slugs, with thousands of eyes and skin as smooth as moon beasts, he called them. And he claimed that the crash of the monoliths was the first step in their plan for coming to Earth. We had hoped to keep these matters private, but because of your own meddling, we've attracted the interest of a third party. Someone that wants to invest in this goose chase, Marsh told me. And to my surprise, he told me that this new company wanted to hire me full-time as a medical professional. You understand, of course, this sort of employment would be off the record, and the Academy would deny any involvement, Marsh warned. I was still dumbstruck by this sudden turn of events, so I did my best to keep my feet on the ground and recap what was happening. So, a fresh-faced entrepreneur company wants to hire me as a medical professional based off my theories related to esoteric magic and star charts from ancient cults, I asked, rubbing the back of my neck sheepishly. I mean, it sounded a bit outlandish. That's all we know. And Mr. Lang is meant to contact you shortly and give you further details, but I should also advise this is not the sort of position you turn down, James. Your papers made the Academy look bad. We're doing you a favor by letting it slide and getting you out of their hair rather than kicking you onto the streets. I grit my teeth, trying to think fast as I stood up and looked at his taxidermy trophies. If that's the case, then it'd be awful for anyone to realize you were ostracizing me just because I spoke the truth, I countered. Marsh raised a weary eyebrow. He knew I was threatening him. What do you want? All we want is to make this go away. Let Osset have the headache, he said tiredly. I knew my demands before he even finished speaking. Herbert and Severn, their expertise in these fields exceeds mine, and in their hindsights will be valuable. They'll be joining me for the new assignment, I told him. Marsh promised he would make it so. And so, he did. I didn't really pay much attention to the details of our transfer to the small town of St. Mauves. There was a clinic there that was reopened for Osset a few months back, and that was where I went to meet Lang. He was a tall, dark-haired Asian man with a brutish spirit, and most of that first meeting is a bit of a blur. I was too eager to find out what sort of work my colleagues and I would be assigned to pay attention. Especially because I knew it meant some of the theories I had written about might be true. When I expressed such excitement to Lang, he promptly offered to give me the charts and notes that were connected to the scandal the Academy so vehemently wanted to cover up. The Zwain incident, he called it. For posterity, I will provide a short summary of what we found in those notes before I explain what we did with this knowledge. Despite being a religious zealot, I was surprised in the writings of Abraham Zwain to find that he was a learned man, and he studied astrology and philosophy quite avidly. He included quotes from Shintoism and even ancient Mayan texts in his writing, which all centered around the belief that the world we live in is not the only one that exists. In short, Zwain saw through the monoliths a secondary realm that exists alongside the one we live in. The true world, as he called it, starkly different than the flourishing life of Earth. Zwain said on the other side of the mirror, life hardly existed at all. There were long, streaking lines of white and strange tall buildings that defied architectural standards of our world, corridors and stairwells that panned whole galaxies and seemed to circle black holes. He theorized that these places were connected somehow to the star charts from the church, and the church itself was in fact a conduit which held more power in our universe than others. A conduit, he claimed, was the result of the collective memory of the culture around that spot. The longer the collective memory could recall details about the location of the true world that existed there, the longer that location would still exist in our world as well. This explained why the members of the congregation felt an otherworldly connection. When they saw and prayed in the pews, they were actually sliding in and out of an alternate dimension. We're hoping we can try to learn some more about this collective memory that he spoke about. We begin trials tomorrow, Lang explained. I should have further questions about all of this, but the sheer excitement to be a part of all groundbreaking discovery was so overwhelming, I kept them to myself. The next day, we had about a dozen people show up to participate in what Lang called a clinical trial. The drugs we administered here are not FDA approved, of course, so we'll be signing waivers and non-disclosure agreements. You'll be paid once the 6-week period had come to an end. In private, he explained to me that each patient would be given a slow drip of psychedelic drugs and other substances that were designed to enhance neurological functions. I began the tests immediately. It took less than 48 hours for one of the subjects to die. I'd like to say that I knew their name, or that I understood why they had died, but I can't say either of those things because I would be lying. I just finished a shift rotation on the other side of the facility where we work to manufacture the equipment of the samples when I heard a loud scream from the patient area. My natural instinct was to run and assist. Herbert was there holding down his patient as she screamed horribly and shook and vomited. After a full recovery about an hour later, I took the time to obtain a statement. You were given approximately 4 doses before you experienced this unfortunate side effect. Could you describe what caused this, or what you feel went wrong? The The patient was looking at us like we were strangers, even though we had been there for a while now. True, we hardly knew each other, but the level of distrust was disheartening. I encouraged openness, especially due to the health benefits. "I'm starting to think that might be a lie," she said, as she coughed up more blood. Per standard protocol, I urged them to explain what caused their outburst. "You'll think I'm crazy, but I saw something sleeking in the shadows. I felt like I was back there in those corridors. I was running from it. The halls never ended, and the strange shadow just kept getting closer." I was soon aghast to discover that 4 other patients had similar experiences, and I had missed them. It couldn't be a coincidence. When I told Lang about it, his response troubled me even more. Increase their dosage, monitor their brain activity. I want to get a clear picture of what they're seeing the next time they have an episode. "Are you suggesting we actively place our patients in harm's way?" I asked. "We're only letting their mental state be at risk. Their physical bodies remain here. We have no means of crossing over to the other side, and neither do the creatures that they're envisioning," Lang said dismissively. I wasn't so sure that was a solid excuse, but I was obeying orders still, not questioning the methods. I wanted to learn more, and it felt like we were finally making progress, and I did as I was told. The results began to trickle again over the next month. Our patients were sharing the same nightmare. I documented what I could, and I found the notions even more terrifying than I care to admit. The first pair, a man and a woman, reported that the dream consisted of a labyrinth, much like the ancient Grecian myth. This one seemed to be haunted by beasts that clawed at my patient's mind long after they woke up. "The bear, it reeks of death. It haunts us relentlessly. We walked in the halls for days, trying to find a place to hide, but each path we took, even if it felt like we were going forward, it wound us back up around the core of that awful maze." When they described the maze, the third patient said sometimes there were doors and stairs. They didn't always appear, but when they did, they would lead to different segments of this starry world. One led to a hotel. The rooms were always empty, but the patients would talk about screams and crying in the empty rooms. Something trying to dig its way out from under. They often felt like their feet were heavier when they went inside these rooms, so they marked them as dangerous and avoided them as best they could. Another talked about a forest. I found his framework quite interesting because it seemed to follow the same principles as the hallways. The forest would snag and twist about, circling a lonesome mountain that the patients never seemed to be able to reach. They would hear distant static that was luring them to the mountain, but the closer they got, the more the massive landmass would remaneuver itself. Lang called these infinite corridors the key to our knowledge of the world. He wanted more information and told me to continue to increase the dosage. It all seemed to be progressing until the first suicide. It had been almost 3 months since we started these human tests. Most of the people we were using had lost sanity. Others seemed to have been driven to stay inside the dream world and refuse to wake up. The patient that passed away was actually one of Herbert's, a young man that came to the clinical trial for money to support his family. He only meant to stay a week. He was given the max dosage to enter the shared consciousness faster, and we documented what we learned via a new method Lang wanted to try, where the dreams were projected onto a screen. The subject, who I must admit I never learned the name of, was immediately thrust into the corridors as soon as the syringe pierced his skin. His readings were familiar to someone who had fallen from a great height. There were rows of doors in front of him, all marked very similarly with the number 3 on them. He approached the first one, tested it out, swinging it open to see another corridor that stretched for miles with glowing blue lights on either side. Before he went in, the subject tried the next door, found the exact same thing. Then they tried another door and another and another, until they were surrounded by open doors that all seemed to be leading to blue, fiery hallways. They reluctantly entered, and I whispered to Herbert if he had ever seen this portion of the alternate dimension before. I've been doing some studying of their mental health as they went to the true world. If I'm not mistaken, the halls and mazes they find in there, they're of their own making. Each time it tosses into this labyrinth, they make new pathways that intersect and grow the maze, he told me. I was fascinated by that theory, but too focused on the feed to provide any sort of insight on what that might mean. There was a single door in front of the subject. This one was already open, and inside there was a slender woman wearing a familiar outfit. Looks like the uniforms from Osset, I commented, trying to get a better look at the woman. She was a redhead with sparkling blue eyes, and I'll admit, even attractive. She was mouthing words we couldn't understand to the subject, and I was trying my best to keep an eye on his physical reaction. Whatever she's saying to him is causing quite a spike in his adrenaline, Herbert said, as he reached for the device that would take the subject out of the dream. Wait, we need to see what happens. This could help us, I said. I regret pushing things that day. The woman kept talking, though. Levels kept rising, and then at the end of whatever speech she had given to our subject, she took out a syringe. It reminded me of the same one we administer to place them within the dream. She plunged it into the patient's neck, and in that instant, they woke. They gasped for air as if they had been drowning, their gaze confused and fearful as they looked at us. What happened in there? I asked. But they didn't respond. Before they even dared to try and comprehend the situation, the patient jumped from their bed and ran towards the nearby railing. They ran straight on past the railing, falling to their death without even a scream passing their lips. An autopsy revealed nothing out of the ordinary for their brain function. Lang considered the whole incident just a simple misunderstanding and miscalculation. I wasn't sure. I kept replaying the footage of the blue-eyed woman in my head over and over. Who was she? Did she work for us? What had she told the subject to make them want to kill themselves? Over the next weeks, those questions were compounded by even more issues with the patients. Some were refusing treatment, harming themselves to stop the dreams. They just wanted to go home. I felt sorry for them. But Lang insisted their work was hardly finished. We've only scratched the surface of what this maze is, what sort of abilities it could give us. We need more players in this game, James. Can you help us? I knew what he was asking. He wanted me to be a recruiter. I played that part quite well. I went back to the academy this time as a representative of the Osset company. Even though this campus had been a part of my home for nearly 2 years, stepping back into it now was overwhelming. I didn't feel very welcome anymore. A few students stopped, saw my badge that represented Osset, made a few hushed comments amongst themselves. Then they zigzagged around to avoid being near me. I turned about to ask what they were saying when someone bumped into me and dropped their coffee on my clothes. "Just watch it!" I said, jumping back and looking at the young woman. She had curly red hair, freckles with blue eyes. She reminded me of the same woman I had seen in the visions of our patients, but how was that possible? "I'm so sorry, are you okay?" she asked as I tried to ignore the burning liquid that covered my shirt. "That's, fine. Do I know you?" I said, as I helped her gather the papers she had dropped. I couldn't help but notice the familiar esoteric symbols and graphs on the paper. Was she a student of Zwain's teachings, too? "I don't think so, but... You know me now. I'm Emma Carter," she told me as she spotted the logo on my shirt. "You're with the corporation we're contracting with?" she asked in surprise. "You're familiar with us. Headmaster Marsh made an announcement about a month ago that we had a new internship program happening with the company, but I'll admit that's not the only time I heard about you. Let's just say that there are a few ugly rumors circling about the people who go to work for them." "Rumors? What kind?" She pointed toward a nearby study lounge, and I followed her to discuss this privately. "You probably know this firsthand, but the people who go to work for you, they never come back and finish their studies. They disappear. I can see it in your eyes. You know it's worse than that," Emma said, while I averted my gaze. I thought about some of the things that had happened to the patients I'd tested with. I didn't want to think that we were hurting them, but I couldn't deny it was dangerous. Some of them had already tried to off themselves, and some had been successful. I'd been pushing these things out of my mind, focusing on the endgame of the research, but something about the way this young woman spoke to me made me pause and realize I was being a monster. "What is it? What do you know?" "I know that we've been dabbling in scientific discoveries that'll shake the very foundation of our entire human race. Alternate dimensions that connect via endless halls." I paused. I paused to see if any of this sounded familiar, and I decided to make a guess about her studies. It's what Pastor Zwain was researching almost 100 years ago, am I right? Emma actually looked surprised I was so forthcoming. "I think I might know something that can help you," she told me. She wrote a time and a place for the South Dormitory to meet that very night. "A group of us have been getting close to unlocking what Zwain learned all those years ago. Bring your own calculations, and I think we can reach a solid understanding of this alternate dimension." I'll admit I was stunned she knew so much about this subject. It made me think about what I had seen in that vision. Was that an alternate reality where Emma had already become a member of OSSET? Yet she was transforming my patients into monsters in that nightmarish place. I thought if I decided to help her and we discovered a way to enter the true world right here on this campus, would it cause the same inevitable reaction for her in the future? Was this what fate was? I didn't have an answer, but the questions troubled me. It felt as though an unseen force was pushing me along. I didn't even feel that my free will was existent as I realized the only course forward would be to meet with Emma and the other Zwain acolytes. Whatever this power is, it wants us to find it. The true world was almost within reach, and new information that could reinterpret the entire universe. As a man of science, I felt there could be no other way to go. I checked the map of the campus and where Emma wanted us to meet. The location was obvious. The dark church, where all of this started almost 100 years ago. I took a break at the cafeteria and took off my coat to eat a fine lunch. With my logo hidden, none of the students gave me dirty looks, and it was nice to think about my days as a learner here. So much had changed since then. The reflection made me feel guilty because of how I was now using these same students for the experiments of Osset. What did I become? I lost my appetite with that thought, collected my things, and went towards the dark church. At this time of day, the ancient structure was empty. Candles were lit, though, from a morning service, and I saw several books laying on the ground around what looked like a magical sigil. I knew better to think this was a mundane act of worship, so I leaned forward to get a better look at the written words. But what I saw made little sense. At least at first. Rakla, Gengyak, Alvak, Befla, Shorak, Yongle. As I kept repeating it in my head, somehow the translations came to me as if the book was telling me what I was trying to convey. Here the disciple Blifel lies. In sleepless nights he bleeds. Kith on, nonwa, inla, daxva, vapai. Awaken his chaos. Let loose his fury. A pit formed before my eyes, the endless void ripping open to give me a glimpse into eternity. This was the true world. I looked around. I should have been waiting for Emma, but the new portal beckoned for me to investigate. From the shadows, I saw light, beautiful and ancient. It swirled and shimmered and shook the room. Immediately the candles fell down onto the ground, the fire shaking and transforming as blood, and dark slime was emerging from their wax, feeding this nameless monster. And the walls around me formed reflections of my own self. No longer was I standing in the Carbuncle Academy. No longer was I in the world I knew and loved. This was something else, dark and mysterious, yet it only spoke to me the truth. As the swirls of anger and blood formed a shape, its unimaginable face became clear to me, and when I saw what the mirror was showing me, I screamed. The reflection shattered into millions of pieces, and I realized how foolish we had been to even step foot into this place. I saw others trapped in the labyrinth. Ones that I hadn't met. I could only assume they came from the other timelines or other dimensions, wandering this place and becoming faceless monsters. They could smell my fear. I stepped forward to try and get the attention of one that looked almost human. He had cut out his own eyes and he was mumbling about like a madman. We cannot see the world beyond ours, for it invites death. Every path, every direction, it leads only to our extinction, he whispered as I passed by. The other creatures were feeding on themselves, crawling and making hallways of flesh as I ran through to find Emma, or to find anything that reminded me of the same reality I'd come from. I saw her at last, standing like she had in the first vision, with a syringe in her hand, but she wasn't alone this time. The tunnel of flesh fell away and I was trapped. I was trapped in a white room with no clear dimensions. Carter stood there next to an operating chair, and beside her was an older man, perhaps in his early 90s, who greeted me cordially. You're the one we have to thank for this new discovery. So I've heard. It's a pleasure to meet you, Dr. Wesley, he said. How do you know me? I asked. My voice sounded hoarse. The walls of this place whisper your name often. Almost every iteration of these endless corridors, your name is the one that these beings chant whenever we ask who sent them here. It would seem that the entities that control this corridor have used you and people similar to you in almost every single dimension to keep themselves fed. You were puppets, pulled here by forces beyond your understanding, and now Now the threshold widens and a new reality will be swallowed up, he said. The experiments. They weren't unlocking any potential for humanity. This was always a trap, I realized. Took you long enough? Emma said, as strange faceless beings strapped me down. What are you gonna do to me? You don't belong here anymore. There's still other places where a harvest must take place. We can handle the workload here, and you will remain our puppet. I looked at the older man, a realization of who he was. You're Swain? The one that killed those students all those years ago? Killed? Oh, heavens, no. I awakened them to their full potential. They're here, part of the endless tapestry. This shared consciousness is a way for our species to live forever, James. What I have done is give them immortality. Emma plunged the syringe into my neck. I'll fight this. I'll find a way to save you, I told her. She looked sad. Her eyes told me she believed it was too late. The walls of flesh began to close in. I was drowning in their vitriol and then coming up for air in the dark church. My hands were clammy and shaky as I walked away from the ritual circle. The Emma I knew was in the doorway, a bit perplexed by my strange behavior. Dr. Wesley, are you still trying to recruit us? She asked. No, sweet child, you have to flee from here. Only devil's work is being done here. We have to get away, I told her. Emma didn't want to leave with me that evening, and it was the last chance I got to speak with her. I sent in my resignation to Osset the following evening as I caught a train to Clear River. They didn't seem to hold a grudge, but instead pressed forward with their work to map and understand the labyrinth underneath. I tried again to reach out to Emma, only to learn that she'd already decided to join the corporation. Feels like no matter what I've done, fate's found a way for the endless halls to grow. The doors to grow more numerous. So I suspect that many others will find their way to these back rooms of the mine and become trapped there. Spread this warning. Stop this madness as much as you can, please. Please, we might not be too late. At the very least, we might be able to be prepared for what comes next. I inherited my parents' old house about a year ago. As a single guy in his mid-20s, this was quite a windfall. My mom had died of a stroke in the upstairs bedroom, a room I now kept mostly locked up. I never knew my dad. He split before I was born, but the house was something he left my mom before disappearing. So, it was a house that's been in his family for generations, and it was the only piece of my father that I had left. My grandparents had been dead before I was born, and my father was an only child. That being said, it was no real family to inherit the family estate when he was pronounced dead, other than my mother and I. As an only child myself, my father hadn't really got around to siring any other brothers or sisters for me. I never really wanted for much. Dad's estate took care of the bills, my education, and the upkeep of the house. I always kind of wished that he had just stuck around if he'd gone that far, but I suppose it finally caught up with him. Mom always said Dad was eccentric, a scientist who studied weird stuff for a research facility, and whatever he did, it must have paid well because I had made it all the way through college without even touching the trust fund that my mom had set up aside for me. And now, I had an 8-bedroom, 3-bath mansion in need of some serious renovation. I decided to start with the attic. The attic had always intrigued me, even when I was a child. I used to like to play up there, looking into all the old chests, peeking into armoires, and scaring myself with make-believe ghosts. It was nice up there. A stained glass window that overlooks the street always made little rainbows on the wood floor just for me. I wanted to clean up a little bit, build an office up there so that I could do my accounting and bookkeeping in peace. The problem was that it was structurally unstable. The wall was a crumbling old brick, the mortar trying to let go for the last 40 years or so. I was afraid that it wouldn't take more than one good windstorm to knock it all in. I really wanted to fix it up and work my way down. As I started cleaning it out, I was delighted to find that the attic might actually pay for its own renovation. It was packed with old furniture and antiques that I found some interest with some of the local antique dealers. I took a few pictures on my phone and sent them to some of the antique shops, and they seemed all the more enthralled to get their hands on them. I separated off the things I wanted to sell, keeping a small pile of things I did not, and after a couple of days of men with dollies coming in and out of the house, I found myself about $25,000 richer. The old attic had more than paid for its facelift, and I started looking at supplies to replace the old brick with. I didn't know if I had to replace the beams behind it, but I suspected that I might. Mom told me that Dad had said that the attic was one of the few original parts of the house, which apparently had been built in the late 1700s. It was one of the first large homes to be constructed in the area, and his ancestors had received it from some fellow after working the land for him. They'd been less indentured servant and more live-in caretakers. The man had hundreds of acres, a large farm, and several dairy cows that needed to be taken care of. My dad's forebears and their children had been more than up to the task, having recently immigrated from Ireland. When he had left it all to them in his will, they had suddenly become very rich and very powerful in what was an up-and-coming part of the world. That would make the attic nearly 3 years old, and the fact that it was still standing was a marvel in itself. I had talked with a friend of mine who was a member of code enforcement for the city, and he had told me to be careful when I started taking down the bricks. He said he was pretty certain they wouldn't be load-bearing, but if the attic was as old as I said it was, then it could be an accident waiting to happen. I had been up in the attic during all kinds of weather, and I'd never seen as much as its sway in the wind. Whoever had built it had done an amazing job, and had certainly built it to last. As I set to work, taking down the first of the brick, I did so with an ear out in case I needed to run. I had barely set my hammer to work when I saw something sticking out between a loose brick. It appeared to be an envelope, an old and yellow thing that likely would have crumbled to nothing had it not been sealed up on the wall. I reached out for it, wiping masonry dust off of it as I looked at the front. It was signed to my child from Marcus Krim. It was dated 1934. This gave me pause. As far as I knew, there was only one Marcus Krim that had ever lived in this house, and that was my father. To my knowledge, though, he had not been alive in 1934. I set the letter aside, not really sure what to make of it, and I kept working. The wall appeared to be held up not by wooden beams, but metal beams. Ones that struck me as weird because the means to do so in the 1700s would have been difficult to achieve. They were crude metal beams, to be sure, but they were very thick and very sturdy, and had likely taken someone a very long time to put into place without a crane or some sort of tools. However the architect managed it, this was tremendous. I would save a lot of my recent windfall by not having to replace the wooden beams that I had assumed would have been there, and decided the flaky wall was just a product of its time. I was halfway through the north face of the wall when I found another letter. The front of this one read, "To my child from Marcus Krim, 1984. The date of the letter seemed reasonable. My father would have been around 12 years old in 1984, but I doubted that he would be writing letters and putting them in the masonry. I set it aside, wanting to get back to work, but it was hard not to open it and see what it contained. This one looked a lot newer than the other one, and I suppose it had spent a lot less time in the wall. Why was my father leaving letters for me inside a wall in the attic? I didn't know, but I supposed that when I was done for the day, I might sit down and see what he had written me. By midday, I had found 5 other letters, and my curiosity was piqued. I had found one from 1984, one from 1934, another one from 1956, and another from 1890, and a 5th from 1854. They'd been stuffed into the wall behind those bricks, popping out as I smashed up the wall with my sledgehammer, and as I broke for lunch, I decided that it might be time to have a look at them. I didn't know if this was some elaborate joke someone was playing on me or not, but the idea of getting letters from a father that I'd never known was intriguing. Maybe the date was a code or something, and I wondered if there was some other treasure to be found in the house, besides the antiques in the attic. I decided to open the letter from 1984 first, it being the closest to today's date. Inside was a handwritten letter in what I recognized as my father's meticulous script. I had seen some of his journals in the library writing on physics and scientific theory, and I was familiar with the way that he wrote. He marked the envelope with a stamp, though I have no idea why, and it had been sealed with wax that crumbled as I broke it. Hello. As I have not yet learned your gender yet, your mother insisted this be a surprise. I will just call you Child. I suspect you have questions, and I wish I could answer all of them, but I fear this letter will be a poor explanation. Your mother may have told you that I was involved with an organization studying scientific principles. One of the principles they were very interested in was time travel. It wasn't something I believed in, but I was willing to take their money and study their theories. I thought the concept was so much hogwash, but as we began to make breakthroughs, I had to admit that there was merit to it. I began to get excited, thinking I might actually break the secret of passing backwards and forwards in time. On the day of testing, we all drew straws to see who would be the one to test the device. I drew the short straw, so I was placed inside the chamber. I pray they didn't send anyone after me because it appears that something's gone terribly wrong. I closed my eyes in 1998 and opened them again in 1984. We'd done it. We'd gone back in time, but there was a problem. I had no way to return, and it appeared that my means of time travel was unstable. I arrived in December of 1984, but 3 days later, I was in September of 1984. I was jumping backward in time. Little hops at first, but I suspect they might become progressively stronger as time goes on. I don't know how to contact you or if you'll ever find these letters, but I know the house has existed for at least 200 years. If I leave a letter in the attic somewhere, it's not likely to be stumbled across until someone is looking for something else. Maybe you'll find it. Maybe you'll know that I didn't abandon you and your mother. You'll know what happened. I'm going to break into your grandparents' house tonight and hide this in the attic. I remember that tonight was when they left me at a sitter's house and went to see a late movie, so there should be more than enough time to get in and leave the letter in the wall of the attic. I hope this finds you well, and I hope that you are well. Sincerely, Marcus Krim. I was speechless for a moment, not sure what to make of it. Was this real? I'd known my father was a little eccentric. Mother said that he towed that fine line between genius and crazy, but this was out there. Had my father been playing some elaborate joke before he left? He had been trying to trick a small child into thinking that his father was just a time traveler, not a deadbeat? I didn't know, but it only made me more curious to see the other notes. I shifted through them until I came to the one from 1956. It was the next one in chronological order, and it seemed the best place to pick up the story. I opened it with a finger, wincing as the old paper sliced me a little. But I sucked the paper cut as I spilled the paper onto the old desk, one that I had kept up here from the antiques. A few drops of blood spattered onto the blotter, but the letter was spared. And as I sucked at it, I read what he'd written there. Child. I've spent the last week shifting backwards every few days. Sometimes I'd stay in a spot for a few days, sometimes seconds, but it seems I'm destined to live my life backwards. I always seem to stay in the same town, the town I grew up in, and it's odd to watch the town slowly grow younger. Opening your eyes to see the town shrinking, a building at a time, I spent 2 weeks leaping backwards at various speeds, but when I finally came to rest in March of 1956, I felt jet-lagged. The town was half the size it had been. The cars are different from the turn of the century as they would be in the early 1900s. People looked at me funny, my clothes likely appearing strange, but my money still worked. The tellers would get a shock when they realized they had bills that wouldn't be circulated for 40 years, but I needed to eat. I didn't have a lot of money when I traveled, 100 and a couple of 20s in my wallet, but as the cost of things goes down, the money stretched a little further. Your grandfather, my dad, is so young. I saw him playing outside the house, a boy of maybe 10 or 11, and it was hard not to hail him and talk to him. I plan to break into the house again when the family is gone and leave this letter in the wall of the attic. I better do it soon. Who knows how long I'll have before I travel again. I hope you're doing well. I hope your mother is also well. It's strange to talk to someone you've never met, but I hope these letters shed some light on where I've been and why I haven't been in your life. I was beginning to think that these notes had been left by my mother, but how had she so expertly duplicated his handwriting? All of my father's journals were written like this, the same meticulous script, and it even sounded like the voice I had always given him when I read his journals. He'd sound like a scientist, like my science teacher had when I was in school. I reached for the next letter. I came across one from 1934. The envelope was ancient-looking. The outside yellowed, sealed in the same wax the others had been. The wax on this one was brittle with age, and it crumbled under the fingers as I broke it. I started to slide my finger under the adhesive, but looked in the desk till I found the letter opener that I remembered seeing there. A quick slash, and I had the note in my hand. Child, I went to sleep 2 days ago after delivering the letter to the wall, and woke up 60 years in the past. This was the longest jump I've ever made all at once. I had to write this one quickly before it sent me sailing off again. The town looks more like Mayberry from the Andy Griffith Show than the bustling city that I remember. Main Street is here, as is the post office and the police station, but everything else has changed. There are stores, but they seem less grand than the ones here before them. The house is still here, and I can see my grandfather as he sits on the lawn with my grandmother, both of them in their senior year of high school. Grandpa will get his draft notice in 6 years, taking him out of the steel mill before the explosion that kills so many and probably saving me from never being born. Grandma will give birth to my father a year after that, and Grandpa will come back from France with a few scars and many stories to regale his son, and later his grandson. I never knew my great-grandparents. Not well, anyway. And it's odd to see them as they go about their lives. I've seen men going into the house for the past few days, men doing work on the study on the second floor, and I've managed to hook a pair of white overalls and caps from a clothesline. Tomorrow I'll mingle with them and drop this letter into the wall, if I'm not years farther from where I started then. I sorted the remaining letters, my work forgotten, and decided on the one from 1890. It was the next one in sequence, though the sequence was far out of whack now. My hands shook a little as I opened it with the letter opener. Fake or not, someone had gone to a lot of trouble to set this up, and the story was so good that I had to know how it ended. My work had been forgotten, the mystery too much for me to put down. As the wax seal fell to brittle shards on the desk, I took out the thick and uncomfortable paper that had been laid into the equally heavy envelope. Child, it appears I sealed my letter in the wall at just the right time. The house was fumigated the next day, and it would have been nearly impossible to get back in. I also traveled again 4 days later, and this one was one of my more hectic trips. I'd be stuck in a time for a day or two, but just as I would pen a letter, I'd be dragged backwards into something else. I've started trading my money for gold and silver as I go further back. I'll soon come into a time when paper money meant nothing, and then I might as well burn the notes to keep me warm. Gold, however, maintains its value, as does silver, and so I now have a few actual dollars left, and some mintings of gold and silver on my person. I've got them hidden in a backpack that also seems to travel with me. I wish I experimented with this a little more, but even though these letters are decades apart, I've really only lost a few months at most. It feels like Just like last week, I opened my eyes in 1984. But I'm becoming worried that I might be slowing down a little. His last trip had brought me to 1890, and the town is little more than a general store, a saloon, and a collection of frontier businesses. I had to steal more clothes, my modern attire marking me as an outsider. I'm thankful that I traded for gold. My money would be useless out here, but gold is always useful. The house is still here too, but I've skipped 4 or 5 generations. The house is now a plantation, the land worked by field hands, and the house set considerably out of town. I went there to seek field work, but they thought that I was a cousin who'd come to call. They put me up, showing a lot of the old family hospitality I'd always heard about, which will make it easy to hide the letter. I hope I come to rest soon. I hope this stops. I go to sleep. I blink, and my heart's filled with dread of where I'll be when I open my eyes again. I hope you're all well, and I hope you're living better life than I am. I exhaled, looking at the last letter. This one was marked 1854, and it was the last one I had. As I picked it up, a thought occurred to me. How many more letters could there be in these walls? How many more could there be that covered dates in between the ones that I'd found? I was no longer skeptical, quite the contrary. I was hungry for more. And as I split this one open, I held the brittle paper gently, afraid that it would fall apart before I got the chance to read it. Child, the traveling is definitely slowing down. I spent 3 months with my forebears in 1890, and after that I spent a month in 1880, 2 months in 1870, and now I've landed in 1854. I've returned to the house again, claiming to be a cousin, and it's odd to see the same people I saw in 1890, 40 years younger. The matron who invited me in is now a mere slip of a girl. Her brother, maimed in a war, is now a healthy young man, passionate about states' rights and the laws that govern man. I'm embarrassed to report that the field hands I saw earlier have been replaced with slaves, but I suppose that was to be expected. They accepted me into their home again, and I suppose I'll stay here until I travel again. I hope you don't hate me too much. There it was. That was it. But I felt like I knew where I could find the other letters. It was late into the night when all the bricks were torn down, and I looked amongst the rubble for any signs of paperwork. I had started out being very careful, an archaeologist looking for old bones, but after hours of fruitless plinking, I began to level the wall with abandon. I no longer listened for the groan of old boards or the crash of the ceiling. The iron bracers held the attic up this long. They'd do it a while longer. I searched and searched, looking for something. When I saw a metal glinting beside a bracing, I went to it and found a lockbox made of rusted old iron. It was a relic. The metal so old it began to disintegrate in places, and I was careful as I knocked the lock off and pulled at the lid. I didn't think it would open for a terrible moment, but as it squealed apart like a funhouse door, I saw a tube inside with a wax cap on the end. Someone had written 1775 on the outside, and I opened it carefully as I dumped the fragile paper out beside the rest. If the paper from the last one had been fragile, then this one was almost elven. It felt like skin. It was so thin that I could almost see through it. The ink was thick and flaky, clearly done with a real pen, and as I read it, I realized I'd come to the end, or maybe the beginning. Child, 1770. I've come back as far as I'm able. The last year was a series of travels, back and back and back. Sometimes I might get as much as a week in one time, but usually it was hours. It seems, however, that I've come to a rest at last. I've been living on the land that will one day be our family home, and I realize there's no old benefactor waiting for us to come to settle here. The land is mostly trees, but I've come to the spot where our house will soon stand. I went into town, the closest town I could find, and purchased it for what I would consider a pittance. The man at the trade office seemed surprised by the amount of gold I had on my person, but it seemed like nothing to someone in our time. I had co-workers who begun laying gold, back for the coming millennium. Sure that the banks would crash and money would be useless, but out here, money is nothing but paper and ink. I was able to buy 100 acres and secure enough supplies to build the house and start the farm. I've shown them how to make metal beams, something I took for granted in my world of metal and glass. House will be strong, and no wooden beams to break and bend. And I secured enough strong backs to help me build it. It's 1773. The construction's done, for the most part. The attic's difficult to build with their current level of technology, but I think we did okay. The house looks like it always has. And as I set up the barn and the fields, I began to loan money to those who are in need. The interest alone has made me wealthy. I've become quite well known in the area. The workers I hired have settled land nearby, and I believe they're establishing the town that will one day encompass this house. 1775. I've lived here for 5 years and have not traveled once in all that time. I think perhaps whatever moved me has dissipated, and I'm now here for good. The town's doing well. They have established a general store and are now a steady trade route on the road west. I have men who work the land for me, who tend the cows and the sheep, and I sit in my mansion and rake in the profits. Life is good, but I'm aware of what's to come. I'm no fool, and I know where this path will take me. 1780. I saw them today. They came to the house, asking for work. My 8-time great-grandfather came onto the porch with his hat in his hand and begged me for a job. Said his wife would be happy to be my cook, and his children would help with the farm. That sounded fine. Most of the young men who helped me build this house and work the land have gone to fight in the Revolutionary War, and I've been struggling to keep up with the chores around here. Thomas has 10 children, a good big Irish Catholic family, and the youngest is old enough to help with the day-to-day affairs of the farm. I agreed to hire them on immediately. I'm the generous benefactor my family legend speaks of, and I'll be dead in the next 15 years. I may have stopped traveling, but I can feel my body aging faster than it should. 15 years is a long time. But I'm sure it'll seem like no time at all to me. 1785. The war's been over for 2 years, but a lot of the men who went to fight haven't come back. I'm going to finish this letter and put it in the attic while I still have the strength. I'm barely 50. I look like a man in his 70s. I can barely make it up the stairs on a good day. I don't know how I'll live another 10 years, but I know that if I don't get this into the wall, it may be my last chance. It's sobering to remember that I'm the one who's responsible for my family's wealth. The one who made it possible for those who came before me to live in relative ease. But I suppose that's the way of it. If you ever find this, I hope you won't hate me too much. It's not my intention to leave you, but I see now that I would have likely been a terrible father. My work held too much of my attention to ever take you to a baseball game or sit with you and spend an afternoon on the couch. I would have neglected you. And for that I'm sorry. This, it appears, is my gift to you. Use it well. You never know when you might be called upon to make your own history. I love you. And I hope you're well. Yours always, Marcus Krim. I sat in the desk and just looked at the collection of letters. It was my dad. He built the house. He'd set our family up, and then he died. He died without telling them who he was. It was unthinkable. And I realized I had no way to prove any of it. There'd be no records going back that far. The original owner of the house had lived before the town did, and any receipts of the bill of sale paperwork, they would not have survived. I suddenly wished Mom was here. She would have wanted to see these letters. She would have likely believed them without question. I wished a lot of people were still here. There was no one to substantiate these claims. I wondered if this was how Dad had felt, as he walked to town to begin building this house. He'd felt so utterly alone, knowing that his only real family was still 10 years away in a place that he'd never seen. I felt so alone, so utterly desolate. And I sat there looking at the letters and thinking until the sun made rainbows the stained glass. As it did, I saw them fall on something I'd missed. It was wedged far in the back behind one of the bracers, and I walked toward it like it might bite. It was another tube, this one carefully placed so that it wouldn't be jostled or broken when it came time for repairs. I opened it, and inside was a beautiful oil painting of a man sitting in the parlor downstairs. The blues looked a little different, the curtains in the style of the late 1700s, but the man sitting in the winged-back chair was someone I knew, someone I seen his picture of before, but he had traded his white coat for a dark, rich suit. His hair was short, more orderly, and he'd grown a mustache. But I'd know him even if he had a beard. It was my dad. And I knew what I would find when I carefully flipped the painting over. Marcus C. Rim. Commissioned 1774 by Warren Fritz. It's framed downstairs now, as are the letters the dad left for me. I think I cherish them more than the house, as well as the knowledge that Dad never really left us. He's always been there, making sure our way was smooth from a gap of generations. He was dying, the freezing water sapping his strength. He pounded his fist against the freezing ice, his lungs beginning to burn. Somewhere a siren was singing like a harbinger of his fast approaching death. He opened his mouth to scream, the siren pounding through his panic-stricken mind. Ice fluid filled his mouth, burning his lungs as he was ejected unceremoniously onto the cold steel floor, coughing and hacking as the hypersleep fluid drained away through the steel grating. The dream hadn't been real, but sirens still blurred all about him. Slowly he climbed to his feet, wiping the noxious fluid from his arms and chest as he learned to breathe once again. Still shaking, he didn't bother to dress, but staggered naked into the crew corridor, heading for the flight deck. Suddenly a woman appeared before him, a light blue aura surrounding her body. "Sorry to wake you, sir, but I have a high level 5 emergency." "Where's the captain?" "Regulations state," she droned, "that the captain should not be awakened for anything less than a level 3 emergency, per Drake Corps regulations." "Fucking Drake Corps," he muttered. "Your objection has been noted and sent to the Drake Corps administration," she announced. "Remind me to deprogram you at some point," he said, walking straight through her. "Any interference with Drake Corporation technology," she droned, following on behind him, "will be classed as espionage and will be dealt with to the full extent of the law." "Like I give a tin shit," he muttered, hitting the button to the vacuum door that led to the bridge, before dropping himself down unceremoniously before the nearest console. "Turn off the sirens, for Christ's sake. Let's see what's going on here." The ship's AI did as she was bid, and the ship fell into blessed silence while he checked the sensors for any kind of disturbance or unusual anomaly. There was a sudden blip on the screen, and his eyes narrowed. He checked all interstellar band waves, and there it was. A distress beacon. Life Pod 6350-2, point of origin G11226, ice planet, Eurydius. "Jjenna," he turned to the still flickering ship's AI, "how far are we out from our destination?" "We are 1 Earth week away from G11226, designated Eurydius ice planet mining colony. Harvested minerals include—" Okay, he cut her off. Didn't ask for a goddamn lecture on the place. Just deploy the grappling hooks, drag that life pod on board. Begin decontamination process. Negative, she replied. Authorization for such procedures must come from Captain Mercer or Lieutenant Harrigan. Fine, he growled. Wake up the captain, then. For once, she didn't argue. Cryosleep procedures for awakening Captain Mercer are now in place. Peachy, he muttered, climbing to his feet and heading for the door. Mercifully, the ship's AI turned its human masquerade off, but Trayton could almost feel its eyes dogging his every step. After popping into the crew deck, he threw on a flight suit and headed down to the cryotubes. Captain Mercer was already up and dressed, shaking off the hypersleep like the seasoned professional he was. Flight Officer Trayton, he nodded to the other man's approach. Jenna's already informed me of the situation. I instructed her to start waking the rest of the crew. Go to the bridge, you have my authorization to use a grappling hook and bring the life pod on board. Put it in dock in Bay 3. I'll meet you there once the rest of the crew is orientated. Sure thing, Captain. Trayton said, resisting the urge to salute. This wasn't a military vessel, although Drake Corps had added a last-minute consignment of 20 security personnel to the Intrepid after communication with the mining colony on Eurydius had gone dark. 30 minutes later, after a smooth retrieval, Trayton stood in Cargo Bay 3. The bay was a small one of its kind. The Intrepid herself was no more than an interstellar scout ship, military class C, bought and refurbished by Drake Corps to visit their off-world colonies. Not for the executives, of course. The big boys traveled in style. This kind of vessel was for grunt work, repairs and parts all the way. In this case, the boys back on Earth had decided there was a serious malfunction in communications, probably caused by solar winds or geomatic storms. But after 2 weeks with no communication from Eurydius, the company had been forced to send an appraisal vessel to see what the hell was going on. The journey with current tech had been around 3 years, a marvel only made possible by technology given to the human race by the Kentorian Empire in exchange for nothing more than water. Not gold or silver, but simple water, of which the planet had in abundance. This exchange had, in a matter of months, advanced human technology to heights only dreamed of in works of science fiction. So what if a few million people died of famine and thirst? The big corporations had got what they wanted. And who do you think was at the forefront of developing these new technological marvels? Who else but Drake Corps, leading the world in interstellar exploration. More like exploitation, Trayton muttered, where he stood next to the captain, lost in thought. You say something, Trey? The captain said, standing patiently as Djenna scanned the life pod for any signs of damage. She's intact, Captain. The blue hologram flickered into life in front of them. One passenger aboard critically injured but stable. The lifeboat's autodock is working on the passenger, one Joseph Hyland, rank minor engineer and marine diver second class. Injuries consist of 4 shattered ribs, 1 punctured lung, multiple cuts and abrasions, scalp lacerations, cracked skull, 1 broken ankle. Current state, medically induced coma. Holy shit. The hell happened to him? Trayton said, shifting uncomfortably. I don't know, a meat grinder or something? The captain ignored him. How long until he's conscious, Djenna? Estimation with current ongoing procedures, 1 standard earthquake, she replied. And if we move him to sickbay? Not recommended, she replied. Any movement at this stage could kill the patient. Recommend we let the autodock continue treatment until the patient is more stable. Understood, the captain nodded before turning to Trayton. Lieutenant, go get the food recycler online. The crew will be hungry after their journey. Go take a shower, Trey. You smell like a cryotube. You got it, Captain. Oh, and good work, Lieutenant, Mercer called after him, but he was already gone, happy to offload the heavy work to the higher-ups. Trey probably stayed in the hydro shower longer than he should have, but today's shower water was tomorrow's coffee, so who cares? Besides, dried-on cryo jelly was a bitch to remove. By the time he left the steaming bathroom, his skin felt tender and raw. He shrugged into a fresh flight suit and strapped on his boots. Luckily, his officer rank had given him the privilege of a private room. It wasn't very big or comfortable on a rig like this, but it was better than sharing 4 to a room like the rest of the crew. Giving himself a cursory glance at the mirror, he headed down to Deck 2 in the mess hall. Like everything else on the ship, the mess hall wasn't very large. All white walls, metal bench-like tables and humming recyclers. Most of the 10-man crew sat at the dining table, whilst the Drake Corps security unit sat a little apart. All except for their sergeant major, who seemed to be in some kind of heated discussion with Captain Mercer. The sergeant was a big man, wide at the shoulders and narrow at the hips. The guy looked like he could drink boiling water and piss out ice cubes. Still, if Mercer was intimidated by the bigger man, it didn't show. He shook his head for the third time and walked over to Trey, who was now standing by the recyc machine, leaving the sergeant red-faced and sweating. "What you having, Trayton?" the captain said, drawing closer. "The meat-tasting goo or the fruit-flavored goo?" I thought I'd mix them together," Trey laughed. "You're a sick fuck, Trayton," the captain smiled. But to Trey, that smile seemed strained around the edges. "You mind me asking what all that was about?" Trey asked, nodding towards the furious sergeant, who had now sat back down and was talking to his men in hushed, conspiratory tones. He didn't agree with my decision to not approach the planet until we can revive the newest member of our crew. Son of a bitch told me to open the auto dock, fill the poor bastard with stims, force him to talk. And when I tell him that would probably kill the guy, he shrugged and called it collateral damage." "What'd you expect?" Trey shrugged. "Compassion from Drake Corps? You know who we work for." "Like we have a choice," the captain said, pouring himself a cup of brown sludge that passed for coffee. "All their competitors been driven under, consumed by the company. You want to work in this business, you work for the corporation." "Yeah," Trayton said, following Mercer back to the crew table. "Drake Corps is building a brighter future for the off-world colonies." "Talking of a brighter future," Mercer said, grimacing at the taste of his coffee, "You've just been promoted to my second-in-command." Trey looked at him, his fork halfway to his mouth. "What? Why? What about Lieutenant Harrigan?" "Cryotube failure." "She isn't..." "What? No," the captain replied. "She's stuck in stasis. Cryotubes reporting medical difficulties, whatever that means. So the damn thing won't open till we get back to Earth. That means you get a field promotion, pal. Congratulations." Trey grinned. Those talking heads at the corporation will be foaming at the mouth when they realize they still have to pay her salary, plus she takes a nice little nap. Not to mention your own pay increase, of course. The captain grinned back at him. "I'll drink to that." Trayton laughed, raising his cup. Mercer looked despairingly at the black grunge in his coffee cup. "With balls like that, Trayton, looks like I chose the right man for the job." The next week was a flurry of activities, under mounting pressure from the execs back home, and, of course, the ever-present Sergeant Major. The captain was forced to slowly approach the still-silent colony until they lay in orbit just above the planet's surface. The live pod, which had been removed from Cargo Bay 3, was now in the medical bay waiting for the autodock to finish its work. Standing by was Chief Medical Officer Michelle Bryans, Captain Mercer, and of course now Second-in-Command, First Lieutenant Michael Trayton. Also the ever-watchful Sergeant Major Dennings. "Okay, Doc," Captain Mercer sighed. "Autodoc says the worst of his injuries has been repaired and he's unstable. Open her up." "I must protest." Bryans shook her head angrily. "It's not recommended to interrupt a procedure until the patient is entirely healed." "I know," the captain sighed, giving the waving Sergeant Major a long, hard look. "But we are on a certain amount of pressure here. Your objections will go into the ship's log along with my own. But for now, just open up the goddamn thing, okay?" Still seriously pissed, Bryans unhooked the umbilical cord from the PDA on her wrist and jacked into the life pod. Seconds later, there was a whooshing as green-smelling antiseptic gas erupted from the chamber. Instantly, the Sergeant Major moved forward, leaning over the open pod. "Highland," he whispered into the pod. "Engineer Highland?" Suddenly, a blood-streaked hand shot out from the dispersing mist, grabbing Dennings by the throat. This was followed by an inhuman scream of madness as the man sat up, swinging his free arm at the Sergeant Major's head. Trey noticed a flash of green as he moved forward to restrain the wild-eyed engineer, but it was too late. Whatever Highland held in his hand, it connected hard to the side of the Sergeant Major's head before clattering away across the room. Dennings was down hard, his face bloody as, even dazed and injured, he scrambled for his sidearm, but the captain, seemingly unfazed by the commotion, came forward, pinned the sergeant major's flailing arm in place with one heavy-booted foot. "Give him a sedative or something!" Drayton yelled at the medical officer, who immediately grabbed up a gleaming needle and rammed it into the still screaming man's neck. Whatever was in that needle hit him hard, and he immediately sank back into unconsciousness from behind Trey. The commotion was still going on as Dennings had now managed to regain his feet and stood nose to nose with Captain Mercer. "Don't you ever put your hands on me again!" Dennings screamed in the captain's face. "And don't you try to draw your weapon on my fucking medical bay!" Mercer shot back just as angry. "What were you planning to do? Shoot our patient? Lose the information you've been busting my ass to get?" Drayton, who had been desperately searching the corner of the room, suddenly found what he was looking for and used it to bang on the ship's hull loudly. Both men span about, their argument put on hold as Drayton tossed the green rock to Dennings, who snatched it nimbly from the air. "You know what that is, Dennings?" Drayton asked. He didn't wait for a reply. "It's jadeite. It goes for roughly 3 million converted US dollars per carat. It actually grows just like a pearl in those crazy clam-like creatures down on the planet's surface. Of course, that's not all the corporation's interested in." He was waffling now, trying to give both men time to cool off. "There's also lithium down there, and of course, the big-time rhodium itself, which of course we use to help us with interstellar travel." "No," the sergeant major said, holding the jadeite up to the light. "Real question is, what the hell are these markings?" Everyone in the room followed his gaze. Inscribed upon the jadeite were a number of strange markings that almost seemed to shift and undulate in the stark whiteness of the overhead lights. After some convincing, Dennings gave up the stone to Captain Mercer, but only after Mercer had promised to report the findings to Drake Corp immediately. "The message has been sent," he nodded to Dennings, "but it'll take some time to receive a reply. Some kind of interference coming from the planet's surface." This seemed to mollify the sergeant major somewhat, who stood up immediately after the last stitch was sutured into place. "I want that man awake and coherent," he said to Bryans, who was now clearing away her bloody instruments. She ignored the looming man, but turned questioningly to the captain, who nodded thoughtfully. "Do it, Bryans, but keep him under sedative." "There's a good chance we won't be learning anything. He could be in a severe state of shock, or his mind could be completely broken." "I understand," Mercer replied, "and I will take full responsibility and I'll wake him up." Bryans nodded and began mixing a cocktail of drugs before gently injecting the sleeping man. At first nothing seemed to happen, but then the man's eyes started to flutter and his breathing evened out. Slowly he opened his eyes, letting out a long, painful groan. Dennings tried to move forward, but the captain was already there. "Hyland, Joseph Hyland, can you hear me?" Again the man groaned. "Can you hear me, Joseph? What happened down there?" "In the deep," the man muttered. "In the dark." "What, Joseph?" the captain asked eagerly. "What happened down there in the deep?" The man muttered again, drool spilling over his slack lips. "In the temple." "Temple?" Mercer asked, looking at the others. "The hell's he talking about?" "Maybe we should show him the stone," Drayton interjected. "I mean, he had it with him. Maybe it could jog his memory or something." "Worth a shot, I suppose," Mercer said, not taking his eyes from the semi-conscious man. "It's in my quarters. Go fetch it, Lieutenant." Trey did as he was bid, quickly heading to the captain's quarters and scooping up the strange stone and hurrying back. Still, his eyes were drawn to the markings as he handed the stone back to his captain. "You see this, Joseph? You recognize it?" Mercer said, holding it up before the other man's face. Suddenly his swimming eyes came into terrible focus, and he began to pour forth scream after nerve-shattering scream, twisting his head back and forth. Blood began to gush from his nose, spattering the captain's startled face. He drew back with a cry. Bryans came forward, needle in hand, but it was already too late. Hyland, his face now spattered with his own blood, issued one last desperate scream, his eyes bulging before he lay still. Head slumped to one side, bloody froth seeping from between his lifeless lips. Bryans dropped the needle, shattering it upon the floor as she rushed over, feeling for a pulse. there was nothing. "Dead," she whispered. "Do something!" Dennings roared. "Look!" She shot back at him angrily, pointing at the blood trickling from the dead man's ears. "Something's ruptured inside. There's nothing more we can do for him." "Perform an autopsy, Bryans," the captain said, wiping the blood from his face. "Start an autopsy immediately. I want the results on my desk first thing in the morning." "Sure thing, Captain," she replied. "And where are you going?" the captain said to Dennings, who was already leaving the room. "I'm going to make my report," the sergeant major replied. "We're going in, Mercer. I can guarantee you that. After this clusterfuck, we are going in." Two hours later, while the rest of the crew was sleeping, Trey was down in the tech lab running an analysis on the strange markings found upon the stone. So far, the database had come back with 0 results of any kind of known language or hieroglyphic markings, both on-world and off. If only he had access to the Cantorian Empire's database. The Cantorians had hinted at other sentient life out there in the Big Black, but as soon as their dealings with mankind were finished, they had disappeared back to their homeworld, of which they had not bothered to divulge, with promises to one day return. Since then, there had been no more communication with this seemingly secretive alien empire. Frustrated and tired, Trayton closed off the diagnostic machines and headed for his bunk, but sleep was a long time in the coming. Early the next morning, Trey was summoned to a crew meeting in the mess hall. Everyone on board was present, except for the Drape Corporation security team, who was notably absent. "Okay, here's a lowdown," the captain said, standing to address his crew. "As for 6 a.m. this morning, I was personally informed by the bigwigs back that Sergeant Major Dennings has been given a field promotion and now holds the rank of commander. Furthermore, although I am still technically in charge of the ship, Commander Dennings has now been placed in charge of this operation." Can they do that?" one of the crew spoke up. "They can do what they please," Trey interjected. "It's their ship. We're on their payroll." Okay, settle down." The captain raised a supplicating hand to silence the angry murmuring. "Like the lieutenant said, it's their fairground. You just operate the rides. I expect this crew to do its duty, but remember, when it comes to the safety of this ship and its crew, I'm still in charge." It sounded good in his own ears, but even he doubted the viability of that statement. "Okay. Now listen up, people. I want 2 engineers down in the hangar bay, 1 to prepare 2 drop ships. You have 2 hours for the departure. The rest of you prepare the ship for a long, sustained orbit above the planet. Move it. They ain't paying us by the hour." "You stay with me," he barked at Trey, who was getting up to file out of the rest of the crew. "Take a seat," he told Trey, who sat back down just as the last of the crew filed out. "What's on your mind, Captain?" "You remember checking the ship's manifest before we left Earth?" "Yeah, sure, Captain. You, me, and Harrigan all checked the cargo listing before taking off, as dictated by the company policy." Yeah. Did you happen to see a rather large stash of weapons on that listing?" the captain continued. "Hell no," Trayton replied. "Just standard sidearms for the officers, a couple of light SMGs in the armory in case of emergencies." "So tell me, Trayton, why, when I went down to the cargo bay, did I find Denning's security team kitted up like they were about to enter a fucking war zone?" You're shitting me," Trayton said, his mouth hanging open. "Not at all, good buddy, not at all. They have military carbines, full body armor, respirators, whole shebang. And when I dared to question the new commander on the whole shit show, you know what he said to me?" He continued, not waiting for a reply. "He told me to mind my own business and prepare to land on the planet. Hell, I think he's about 2 steps away from having a couple of his goons drag me out of there." "So what the hell are we going to do about this?" Trey asked angrily. The captain shrugged. "Not much we can do. Happy asshole is now in charge, so we're going to take him down to the planet and let him sort this whole debacle. Then once we leave and we get back home, I give those Drake Corporation assholes my stripes. Get off this merry-go-round once and for all." Two hours later, both men were stood in the hangar bay, waiting for the pilots of 2 dropships to run over their final checks. Dennings' now heavily armored security team had already entered the ships and were strapped in place, waiting to dust off. "What do you mean, a representative of the ship?" Captain Mercer spat in the now smiling face of Commander Dennings. "I think it's something to do with an insurance issue," Dennings continued to smile. "Either way, the company says an officer from the ship must accompany us down to the planet's surface. Obviously, you being the captain and your second Lieutenant Harrigan being indisposed for the foreseeable future, neither of you can accompany us. This leaves Second Lieutenant Trayton here," he said, his smile growing broader. The captain sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Looks like you're it, Trayton. I don't like it, but it seems like we ain't being left with much of a choice." "That's right, Captain. You really don't," Dennings replied. "If you please, Lieutenant," he said, waving Trayton towards the waiting ship. "Oh, and I will be taking that," he said, pointing towards Trayton's sidearm, which he had strapped on this morning for some reason. In the light of recent events, it gave him a kind of cold comfort. There was no way he was giving it up to these corporate thugs without a fight. "I don't think so," he said, taking a step back from Dennings' reaching hand. "You guys are packing enough firepower to overrun a small city, and from what we saw in the medical lab, I think we can count out a little communication error or faulty wiring down there. So if you want me to come with you quietly and my full cooperation down there on the surface, then I stay armed." Dennings thought it over. "You at least proficient with that thing?" Trayton grinned. "Won't you stand up against the wall, Commander? Put an apple on your head. We can see what happens." "You threatening a commanding officer, Trayton?" "Not at all," Trey replied. "Just a little humor, Commander. Just a little humor." "Get on board, Lieutenant. Take a seat." Still smiling, Trayton boarded the ship. "We'll be in constant communication from the planet's surface." Dennings turned back to the captain. "I want constant surveillance on my squad from the bridge. I intend to have this issue resolved with the utmost haste, but until then, you watch your ass, Captain. You understand?" "Absolutely," Mercer replied, his face carefully neutral. Dennings staring into the other man's face for a second or two longer, then turned and boarded the ship. From the bridge, Captain Mercer watched the two dropships dust off and approach the swirling atmosphere of Eurydius. For some reason, he had a sudden urge of foreboding, and a cold sweat broke out all over his body as the two ships disappeared into Eurydius's frozen heart. Sergeant Hagar tapped his finger on the polished mahogany counter. He figured he must have booked 20,000 people into police custody by now. Most of them were guilty of something or other, even if it couldn't be proven. That was a lot of broken souls for anyone to encounter, even him. The daily grind had sleepwalked him right up to that figure. The math was simple. Simple enough even for a cop. Even an about-to-be ex-cop. It was time. Time multiplied by people. 29 years, 364 days, to be exact. But tonight would see him tip into that magical 30-year figure. He was finally leaving, putting everything from his old life behind him. He had spent the last 20 of his career years etching himself into people's memory as the man in charge of the cells, a man with a reputation for brutal honesty and uncompromised morality. Professionally, he was a remarkable man. He was just working in an unremarkable station located on the fringe of South London. Dutifully, he had played the role of custody sergeant, his foot planted on the bottom rung of the promotion ladder, slowly aiming towards this day. While outside, the changing world had marched along with progressful certainty, working life in the bowels of a 200-year-old police station had remained pretty much the same. Sure, the computers had become smaller, the display screens had gotten wider and thinner, but it seemed that for the people passing through, drunk and angry, was pretty much a universal constant, one which showed no indication of changing any century soon. Humanity was an ugly disappointment when viewed from this low down, and if you spent too long staring into its faces, eventually they all blurred into one. A typical shift would see Hagar book in every person who'd gotten themselves arrested and brought through the back door. He would speak to the officers, who it seemed were always getting younger, and ensure there were enough grounds for the prisoners to have been detained. Finally, he would review all the evidence, making a decision on what, if any, charges should be faced. Now it was coming to an end. In his more reflective moments, he sometimes questioned himself. Should he have done something different with the last 20 years? Perhaps. But there was always more time ahead, time to do something else. Although he was at his usual station, standing behind a long, antique counter, and could, if boredom took him, count the thick iron bars on the high windows in front of him, this was not his normal workplace in the building. Visible clues would be a selection of hand-drawn wanted posters, sepia-tinted, pre-aged. They were pictures of rough-looking characters with old-worldly names, who sported an assortment of thick beards and cartoonish mustaches. But the only thing that really gave the game away was the large sign on the heavy oak door behind him. The sign which proudly stated in bright blue font, "Gift Shop." This explained the pile of calendars for sale, the rack of comedy postcards, and the shelf crammed with novelty police box teapots. For his final week, Hagar found himself working in the police museum that was attached to the usual station. Once this wing had been a local magistrate's court, back in the Victorian era, but due to ever-increasing demand and despite the Crown prosecution's reluctance for modernization, a decision had been made to close it and relocate to a larger, centralized court complex miles away. One that could handle the growing numbers of cases from multiple divisions all under one roof. Times change. As a result, the old court annex had lain unused for years, until about the time the human resource manager started replacing staff officers, and as a part of a modernized shift towards public relations, it had reopened, rebranded, and reborn as the Police History Museum. Change for change's sake, Hagar thought. None of it made much difference. It got about as many visitors as the station got thank you letters. Hagar didn't know which of the two statistics he found the most depressing. He scrolled through old admin requests and browsed 20 years of emails whilst he stood at the only connected working terminal, killing time. It wasn't by means of any punishment that he found himself working there. Quite the contrary, the reason he found himself working as a slightly overpaid and infinitely overqualified security guard was to keep him out of an evidence chain. Currently, he had no upcoming court cases threatening to demand his attendance. For someone about to retire, that's a significant thing. You don't want to get dragged back for a prolonged trial, especially if you're no longer being paid to. It was a point that the Force considered also. From their perspective, there was no point in losing an expensive case because your key police witness is reluctant, or perhaps decides not to show up. Or even worse, becomes hostile, because they're no longer on the payroll. Sergeant Hagar, though, would never do anything other than his duty. He had sworn an oath. Retired or not, cop or not, an oath was an oath. Taking break from staring at a screen full of old correspondence, he stood up, setting aside his reading glasses, polishing them absent-mindedly as he did, and for the briefest of moments, thought he caught a spark of reflected red light. Brake lights, perhaps, from outside. He looked around at the dim light that pushed into the dark. There was no point lighting the whole place up at night, apart from a small desk lamp. The only illumination was from the LCD display in front of him and a row of CCTV monitors on a shelf behind. Photos and paraphernalia covered two of the walls. A third wall had been removed to accommodate the museum's prize exhibit, an '83 Ford Capri. Under the hood, it had a 2.8 engine, fuel injection, painted up with its blues and twos. It had been the hottest thing on the streets, a real thief catcher, once. Everything got old. To his right were 3 holding cells, architectural relics from the Victorian court in the next room. They'd even been used by a TV crew once who happened to be filming a Victorian drama. Every cell was windowless, painted brick, complete with original cast-iron bed and a row of gated bars at the entrance. A wooden slop bucket had been added alongside a toy rat for a mild, gruesome effect, should tourists ever appear. Hagar didn't mind his own company at night. In fact, he preferred it. His usual team would be working through the night till 7 a.m. He was planning to lock up and finish sooner than that. He had hoped that he might squeeze in one last kebab with some of the team as they came in for refreshment, and say some obligatory goodbyes. With any luck, he'd be done by 1. 6 hours early finish on your last duty shift. He figured that after 30 years, any cop pretty much deserved it. There was no gold watch coming his way. That was sure as shit. He only wished he could look forward to saying a final goodbye with a fraction of the enthusiasm he held for his kebab order. A large antique clock was hung high in front of him. Glancing up, he could see it was almost midnight. Over the last half hour, the volume of its steady ticking seconds had seemed to grow, as if attempting to penetrate the depths of a late and soundless night. Other than that, the general sense of silence had seemed to swell, absorbing the usual creaks and groans of the old building into it, almost as if the silence had developed its own gravity. Hagar swore that he could hear the blood circulating around his ears, just that rushing blood and the ticking of the clock, growing ever louder. Tick. Louder. Tick. Louder. Tick. It stopped. It stopped, and the silence roared into the space it had left behind. It was a moment of pause, that gap in time you feel like the pause in your favorite dance anthem just before the bass drops, or that second before the heavy guitar riff screams in. The absence of noise that, despite its nature, has its own sound, not quiet, you could hear it. Hagar could definitely hear it. And if he'd had hair where his thick neck met his shaven head, it might have stood up just a little. Again, that stray spark of red light glinted. He pinned it down this time, coming from inside the cell nearest to him. This time it didn't blink away, it remained, holding back in the shadow of the far wall, almost as if a single pixel had escaped from his monitor into the world. Curious and curiouser, he thought, walking around the counter and approaching the cell gate. As he did so, another match pinprick of red snapped into existence, both of them now just a couple of inches apart. Lights in the darkness. Locked in the gloom of the cell, they grew larger as the redness dulled, morphing slowly into the shape of human eyes. Eyes that fixed on him. Hagar had dealt with every sort of person you could have the misfortune to meet. Over his years here, he had stared into the eyes of thousands. He dealt with liars and kidnappers, blackmailers, rapists, terrorists, child murderers, and worse. Remorseless, broken individuals that would knot your stomach as if you'd swallowed razor wire or raise a blinding storm of anger inside of you demanding justice. But none of them were like what stood before him now. None had eyes that glowed like embers. Eyes which were pulling in the light of the room towards them as they began to consolidate in the darkness. A darkness that gave form, bleeding the black shadows into limbs and torsos as it manifested the night into physical form. The featureless face sought to hold him in place by the intensity of its glare. Peeler, it half whispered, half sang from out of an invisible mouth. The voice was cracked and inhuman, like metal twisting through a drain. A peeler was the nickname given to the world's first formalized police, after the founder of Sir Robert Peel. These first officers were referred to as bobbies or peelers. Peelers had been dropped the best part of 100 years ago. Bobbies had managed to stick around a lot longer. Peeler, he'd repeated. I've been waiting for you. And with that, the heavy oak door of the gift shop slammed shut of its own accord, as if guided by an invisible hand. There was no other obvious exit. The building was, after all, very much designed to keep people inside. Hagar took a deep breath, stepping backwards. "The hell are you?" he asked. It laughed, a savage mockery of humor. "Look into my eyes. After all these years, just watching. I know you, Sergeant. Sergeant Diggory Hagar." Hagar paused for a moment. The police manual definitely didn't cover this. "No one calls me Diggory here. It's just Sergeant. It's been Sergeant for 20 years. No point changing that now, not even for you." The shadow made a hiss. Hagar interpreted it as an expression of frustration at him, not showing the expected terror and fear that it seemed to expect. "What's your name?" Hagar asked in the most level workplace tone he could muster up, considering the circumstances. "My name is..." The shadow went to say something, but couldn't. As if its voice had been taken away. There was a pause, a crack in the menace. What little light in the room blinked out for a second, and when it came back, the shadow was darker than ever, standing in a cell covered in blood. The floor was wet and glossy, the wall ran thick with black strands of congealed rancid matter. The stench of stagnant blood flooded Hagar's nostrils, causing his throat to reflexively gag. "Is my name," the shadow proudly declared. The lights blinked again, and the cell stood untouched, without any trace of what had been there moments before. If the expectation was to terrify Hagar, it made him shrink from his sanity, to freeze the marrow of his bones, drenched him in his own fear and panic, and then it had far from succeeded, for Hagar stood worryingly composed for a man in his predicament. "I didn't catch that," he said, and maintaining composure added, "How do you spell it?" Not blood this time, but fire. Fire burned from floor to ceiling, a great shaft of brilliant yellow that licked across the bars, dripping like metal amber to the floor. The terrible shadow screamed deafeningly, standing framed in the fire as a great wall of heat blasted forward, powerful and overwhelming, only for it all to stop as it reached beyond the bars for Hagar. "Open the gate. Release us," it screamed with that metallic voice echoing like a train crash. Hagar looked over his shoulder, checking himself. No fire damage, no smoke, not even a scent of the fumes remained. "I don't think you know your name. Or rather, I don't think you know your name anymore," Hagar said. And for the first time it seemed that there might be more to this old desk sergeant than there appeared. A pause. The creature of shadows stepped forward, right up to the iron gate, making no sound as it glided near, wrapping hands shrouded in black mist around the bars. "I am a demon. I have no name," it declared in its tortured imitation of speech. "You bricky peeler bastard." But that second sentence sounded different. Awkward, somehow. Out of place. "I have been waiting for you. Waiting so long for us to be alone. Come closer, so I can tell you what I'm going to do to your family, your mother, your wife, your imbecilic offspring, if you don't open this gate." A dark hand reached out to grasp from the bars, coming within inches of Hagar's face. The shadow gave a tortured cry as its hand began to disintegrate upon passing the border of its confinement. Snatching it back, it howled in agony. The calendars flew off the counter. The postcard rack emptied itself upon bursting like giant confetti as the row of teapots exploded into ceramic shards. "Come closer," the shadow screamed. "No. Not yet," Hagar replied casually, rolling up a cigarette. "You're not entirely a demon, you know." He paused, fishing in his pocket for a lighter. "I know who you are." But first I'll tell you a story. Then we'll talk about this gate. He lit up the cigarette, inhaling deeply. 100 years ago, my grandfather, Samuel Hagar, the self-professed demon, screamed at the name. The lights flickered. Do you mind? Hagar continued, seemingly unimpressed. He was a young constable, fresh out of the box, as we say. He was walking his beat when he was approached by a shopkeeper wanting to report a robbery. Not a pretty theft, mind you, proper robbery. 2 young men had come into his store and threatened him at knife point. He said they took £5 off him. A whole week's take back then. The shopkeep didn't know one of them, but he did give the name to the other. It wasn't hard then for my grandfather to track him down, make an arrest, bring him back here. The £5 was never recovered, and the young man found himself charged and held here to appear before the magistrate the next day. Came out this young man had been courting the storekeeper's daughter. He was, shall we say, not too happy about the situation. Some street kid with his daughter. He had high expectations for her, expectations to marry upwards, not fall in love with some poor commoner. So he fabricated the robbery just to have the kid arrested. The poor kid had a poorer alibi. When they questioned him, he said it couldn't be him, no way. No, he was with the shopkeeper's daughter at the time. When she was asked outright in front of her father, she didn't dare confirm it. He was telling the truth. There's no way for him to prove it. He sat in his cell, broken-hearted, awaiting trial the next morning, but he never appeared. Instead, he twisted his bedsheet into a rope, wrapped it around his neck, and he hung himself off these very bars. Hagar knocked them with the back of his knuckles to emphasize the point. Iron bars. Remember that, it's important, he continued. The shopkeeper's daughter was racked with guilt and soon after ran to tell the police everything, but it's already too late. Her father was arrested. She went to the poorhouse. There ends the tragedy of William Boyd. Hagar raised his hand as if to hail a cab, only to wave casually. Hello there, Will. The shadow howled. Its eyes lit up brighter than ever. It smashed itself against the walls to try to flee. No! It screamed. No! Not true lies, all lies. I am a demon. I am fire. I am blood. It was the shadow's weaker voice again, but overly enraged this time, as if trying to convince itself as much as it was Hagar. The voice soon switched back, though, more seductive, greasy, confident. No, not William Boyd. Not that sniveling wimp. You will bend to me and be our vessel from this place. I will not, replied Hagar, resolutely, as he continued. It's William Boyd I'm talking to. It was your name and life, William. You take 100 years to manifest yourself today, this time. It should have been plenty for you to make peace with your passing from this place to the next. But you're consumed with a more than human appetite for rage and fury. What do you know of rage? Cried the shadow. This time Hagar couldn't tell which of the voices within was speaking. It sounded as if they both were. What do you know of fury? Hagar let the question soak into him as he made his reply. I've known rage beyond this world's comprehension. Hagar's voice had turned to steel itself. I've drowned in the vast, untamed sea of it. My wrath unshackled without any desire of constraint. I've launched fury towards the heavens, scorched the blessed wings of angels with my indignation, even as they sheltered under God's grace. Don't think to skulk in shadows and measure your rage against my own. You'll be found lacking. Look at me, demon. It would not. The shadowy form seemed to look around itself, frantic, desperate to look anywhere, but back into the intense blue fire that now blazed behind Hagar's own eyes. I said look at me, Hagar commanded, his voice now resounding with absolute authority from a place 100 feet below, flawless, ancient, chilling. The building shook, the CCTV exploded, and all the headlights of the '83 Ford sprang into life for the first time in years. The walls' geometry began to bend and curve, cracking as reality was interrupted. They stood now in a half-world glimmering in blue light from an invisible source. Hagar grew as he shed away his uniform, burning it from his skin which had turned to dark blue hues of scales and spikes. Hagar had become a hulking, muscular mass of sinew and claws, who now wore a pair of curved horns as a crown. Every demon knows his name, and I have had so many. I am Hagar, the Forsaken, the Wretched, Lord of the Forgotten, Keeper of the Void, and I am here for William Boyd. The echo of his voice subsided to a volume more bearable. The shadow shrunk back from the bars and pressed back into the far gloom, trying to hide within. The demonic form of Hagar began with his explanation. I see so clearly as my true self. So much easier to understand now what needs to be done. Thinking inside a human brain had been torturous in its limitations for Hagar. It was good to be back in his usual self and size. He stretched, cracking a few of his additional vertebrae into their correct place. In life, William, you were plagued by an under-demon from the shadows, one who loves to deceive and torture, drawn by the vile acts committed against you. It poured its poison deep into the corners of your mind as you sat alone, contemplating your trial and the loss of your love. It killed you every inch as much as you killed yourself, William. This demon is with you, tied to your fate through iron. We, demon kind, are bound by it. Your death against these bars has tied its soul to yours. It was incompetent enough to stay within you at the time. Hagar laughed at this revelation, his twin rows of terrible teeth shining in the blue light, a rookie mistake for a younger demon. Even now he leeches your soul away, twisting you to imagine yourself as it. Traitorous dog. Why are you doing this? Spat the thing of the shadows. Ah, so there you are at last, said Hagar, not hiding behind this wretched soul now. He's so weak, always so frightened, a useless waste of my time. Free us. We can ruin fresh souls by the hundreds, answered the shadow. I have grown beyond such pettiness, said Hagar. Now tell me, demon, tell me your true name. I am Drew, the Deceiver. Why then, Lord of Forgotten, why are you here? Speak of your purpose. I choose to remain, Hagar replied, waiting for the moment William's soul would manifest. I command you now to detach yourself from him. Can only do that with another warm vessel, now that we've manifested, can't I? The shadow appeared to be sniffing the air. Fetch me another one, I beg you. There are others in the building. I can taste them even from here. Then, almost as an afterthought, it added, Have you lived here? Hagar snorted. Sergeant Hagar died over 20 years ago. I merely adopted this likeness of him. Ever since my exile from hell, I have choked on his humanity. Exile? Wait. You've been him for 20 years, exclaimed Drew, edging a little nearer once more to the bars. You've been bound to this place for 100, Hagar snapped back. 20 years, 1,000, what difference does it make to one such as us? I was there at the beginning. I will be there at the end. 20 years is nothing to me, nothing. I spent thousands of years on my ascent. Not easily do you clamber from hell's depths. You must realize that the pit is already inside us. It is ourselves who must climb from to escape, replied Hagar, looking around the room. He wet his lips with a serpent's tongue and tilted his head in recollection. When I told others of this, Lucifer was... Hagar paused, searching for a word that would never translate to English. extremely displeased with me. I was thrown out into the world, hurled through existence. I watched the heavens assemble and this universe expand into life. I rippled through fabrics of time, finding a gateway for my arrival. Poor Sergeant Hagar was standing in the path of my emergence. Human. Such flimsy vessels. My soul tore right through his. A shame he couldn't survive it. But I could feel his spirit, so righteous, so full of purpose and potential. All he was, or could be, imprinted on me in that instant. Hagar tapped the back clawed finger of his scaly forehead. He's still in there somewhere. He corrected himself. Again, that hideous smile. It was his turn now for a second voice. Diggory Hagar's human voice, just for a moment. I'm here still. Somewhere. A sense of duty of his forever rattling around in me. I'm beginning to think it might not fade. And you know what? I don't mind it. I don't mind it at all. I know exactly what I'm going to do now. I'm going to help the soul of William Boyd. But we're demons. We don't help them, Drew protested. Don't we? No, Drew replied in disgust. Are we demons always evil? Asked Hagar. Yes. Always, replied Drew. Do you think demons have free will? Asked Hagar. Suppose we don't have a choice about it, replied Drew, petulantly. Hagar continued. Is our evil true? If we couldn't choose not to be any other way, were we created for this, made for this, then the evil would lie within the Creator. Or are our choices the evil thing, Drew? Evil requires purpose for malevolence. It needs intent. Drew was silent, struggling for an answer that wasn't an agreement. And my dear Dreamin' Drew, if I could choose to be evil. Hagar extended his arm, aloft, conjuring a ball of glowing blue light from his outstretched fingertips. Then I choose not to be. Drew began to talk quickly now, with words overflowing one after another with a glowing terror. Don't try and help. You'll never return through Hell's Gate by vexing Lucifer. This will only make things so much worse. Free me. Together we can gather souls of tribute. Return with glorious torments. I can't do that, Drew, Hagar replied. I'm trying to be better. The ball of blue light was getting brighter, expanding, the light beginning to drip down Hagar's arm, making a pattern where lightning and fire etched protective runes of chaos into his scaled skin. You're just a demon, screamed Drew. You can't be better. You can't be anything else. Tell me, Drew, if hell can submit to a fallen angel, should heaven not embrace a rising demon? With that, Hagar thrust his huge arm, shielding and dancing blue light through the gap in the bars, bending them aside and seizing the shadow around the neck. Drew grabbed frantically at the giant wrist, but there was nothing he could do to break the vice-like grip that held him. You've tortured William long enough, Hagar said, as he began dragging the shadow painfully through the iron bars, shearing the demon away from William's soul inch by inch as he did so. William's soul form fell from the shadow to the floor, pale and translucent, little more than a skinny boy of 17. Hagar held him to stand, lifting him with one arm, all the time gripping the slumped form of the demon Drew with the other. A doorway of light opened ahead where none had existed before. William was already waving toward it. He could see the girl he loved 100 years ago waving back at him. Go on, said Hagar, and don't look back. William walked into the light and disappeared. Hagar couldn't see the girl himself, but he'd guessed correctly that William would. All Hagar could see was Diggory Hagar's grandfather, shrouded in golden light. The happy old man smiled at him and nodded. Hagar nodded back. "It's open for you too, Diggory, if you're ready," the old man said. Hagar took a moment, smiled, and shook his head. "We've got things to do. Maybe next time." He threw up an honest salute, as formally as a 9-foot demon could manage. "Next time," his grandfather replied, returning the salute as the doorway gently faded. Hagar remembered the demon that remained tightly in his grip and pulled the wilted form of Drew back up to face him. "Back with me?" Hagar asked. Drew grunted and began to curse in Latin. It was nothing Hagar hadn't heard before. Gesturing with his free hand, he began a pattern in the air. Red wisps began to form until a swirling sigil appeared above him. "People always think hell is down," he mused to himself. "Time to go, Drew." No, don't send me back like this," Drew begged. "I'm sending you back with a message for all lost souls for demonkind, even for Lucifer himself." Hagar's eyes glowed bright blue flames as he stared into the face of shadows and bellowed, "Anyone can rise." Hagar thrust the form of Drew effortlessly upward, releasing him into the heart of the portal. It sucked him greedily inside before Drew had any further chance to protest. 1 a.m. He was quiet again, which was a good thing. With a little effort, Hagar had resumed his human form, though the runes had remained branded into his human skin. He materialized his uniform back into existence and buttoned up his shirt before heading to the cleaning cupboard. After 15 minutes with a broom, the museum was acceptable enough for the morning team to cope with. His human body had already started telling him that saving souls was hungry work. He remembered his takeout kebab would be waiting for him by now, and that he still had a few very human goodbyes to give. After that, who knew what a reformed demon might do in this world? Demon Hagar was unsure whether he could ascend beyond this plane, especially with Diggory's soul sticking around like a second conscience. God might not be happy about it, and hell certainly wasn't going to be. There would likely be consequences down the line. But it was a good enough place to start, thought Hagar. And good was good enough. For now. The job at the gas station was a blessing when they called me, but it had become something of a meglim before I finally quit. I worked the closing shift at the Fill and Go for the better part of 8 months. And it was 8 months of making coffee, stocking coolers, listening to weary women with too many children, arguing about what you could and couldn't buy with EBT. My first job was construction, working as a carpenter's assistant since I was 16. And after the big layoff during the pandemic, I was tempted to go back. The amount of construction work hadn't changed, but the call for laborers had waned, it seemed. Suddenly, I was forced to look elsewhere for work, and my savings were starting to get dangerously low when the Fill and Go finally called me. The worst part about the job wasn't even the job itself. Not really. The worst part was the walk home when the day was done. I lived in the Shady Oaks trailer court, about 3 blocks from the gas station, and it just made sense to walk to work. I didn't have a car. It was one of the first things to get repoed when I was out of work. So if I needed groceries or booze or a bite to eat, I was walking. It wasn't much of a problem. I liked to walk, but it was the sights that made the walk unbearable, especially at night. Walking past Orrin Wood in the middle of the night was enough to give anyone the shivers. Orrin Wood had existed long before the children's home that had given it its name, but the long-gone orphanage was why it was infamous. Established in 1819, Orwin Children's Home was a place for cast-off children from all over. The rambling plantation home, lovingly donated by Miss Orwin before she died, boasted 30 acres complete with a barn, fields for growing, a pond for fishing and swimming, and a lot of room for rowdy growing children. At its peak, it had held some 120 kids, and had been a place for new beginnings and fresh starts for many lost boys and girls. Those were not the reasons it was remembered, however. The reason it was still whispered about in fireside stories was the fire of 42. Now, by 1942, the orphanage had fallen into despair. They had some 30-odd children they were caring for, and the consensus was that the fire must have been set for reasons of insurance fraud. Others claimed it was a candle that was left lit after bedtime or stray spark from the fireplace. However it was started, the results had been devastating. 30 people lost their lives in the fire, 25 of them children, and that was when the stories began. You could still see the ruins of the children's home as it hulked in the overgrowth, reclaimed by the forest after the blaze, and the area around the hulk was supposed to be haunted. Lots of people had seen ghostly apparitions, handprints in the dirt on their cars, or had toys glide into the road without warning. The Orwin Woods played into a lot of local legends, and it was widely agreed upon to be a very haunted place. I explain all this so you understand why I might have been a little eager to get home on my evening walks. Nothing strange had ever happened to me, nothing besides that feeling of unseen eyes watching you until last night. Last night I got off work to find about a foot of fresh snow on the ground. It had been expected. I had watched it come down all day as I rang up coffees and gas for customers. I had walked to work through flurries earlier that day and dressed accordingly. Still, I thought as I pulled my hood up and turned to lock the door behind me, that wouldn't stop it from being a cold, wet walk home. The dark gas station disappeared behind me as I started schlepping home, the night cigarette already between my teeth. It's a terrible habit, I know, but it's about the only vice I can afford to have these days. Tonight, however, I was having a hell of a time getting the tip lit. Every time I would lift my lighter to spark it, the wind would pick up and blow my little flame out. Cold as it was, however, the shiver that passed up my neck had nothing to do with it, as I came even with Orwin Woods. I tried not to look at it as I walked past. The forest, a dark shadow on my left, like almost any night. I could already feel those phantom eyes as they marked my passing, and I kept my gaze firmly ahead. My grandma had always told me that when you sense the supernatural taking a notice of you, it's best not to let it know you see it. Some things don't like being seen, Bug. Remember that, she would say. And it made a lot of sense on nights like tonight. I was still trying to get the cigarette to kindle, but the wind was keeping me from my evening smoke. I put my hand up to block it, but it seemed my fingers weren't even a good enough barrier for the capricious gusts. The unlit cigarette was a good distraction from the creepy woods, however, though maybe a little too good. If it hadn't been for the snow, I would have walked home without incident, but I supposed I could have also unknowingly let something follow me in, too. Suddenly, I was done with the games. I was jonesing for a smoke, and I bent almost double as I tried to spark the tip. 3 clicks and a lot of cursing later, I managed to get the flame to stick, but as I took that long, first drag of gaseous pleasure, I noticed something beside me on the sidewalk. It was a pair of footprints. No, not just any footprints, a pair of children's footprints. Now, I don't mean shoe prints either. I mean, I could count the individual toes on these prints. And there were a line of them beside my much larger ones. I didn't know when they had picked up my trail, and I didn't really care either. Whoever had made them had disappeared, and I looked around curiously. It was 23 degrees outside, so my phone said when I left the station. And I was looking for the kid, bold enough to walk barefoot in the snow. There was no one. No footprints going hastily away from mine either. I was alone in the snow, though the fact that they had stopped right next to my own let me know I might not be as alone as I thought. I glanced back, wanting to see if I'd been mistaken, and that's when I saw the second set. They had stopped about 5 feet behind me, but they were just as plain as the first set, and the wind hit me again. I tried to keep my teeth from chattering. The chill I felt had nothing to do with the weather, and I found my eyes drawn to the new prints as they waited patiently for some sign. 2 perfect pairs of tiny feet. Sitting placidly in the powder. Then before my eyes, a third set came crunching towards me, and my cigarette made an angry hiss as it hit the fresh snow. I was running before that third set came even with the second, and this seemed to be the sign that it had been waiting for. I heard those bare feet as they slapped wetly at the concrete behind me. My head cried out for caution. It would be very easy to take a tumble out here and get hurt, but my desire to get away was up, and my adrenaline was coursing in the face of this formless threat. I slid as I rounded the corner, but my sneakers held purchase as I kept showing my heels. I could feel the burn in my chest as I ran, my breath steaming like a loco as I ran for my life, and I knew if they caught me, I would never see home again. None of the stories I'd ever heard about the woods spoke of children hurting anyone, but the sounds of their ghostly feet, I guess they weren't trying to sell me cookies. By the sound of it, there were more than a dozen after me, and I could just imagine the intentions of this legion. I saw their trailer park coming into sight, but that seemed to be where my luck ran out. I came off the curb running flat out, and when I hit the patch of ice, I stumbled and went down hard on my outreached hands. I was lucky, I suppose. If I hit my head and gone unconscious, there's no telling if I would have ever woken up. As it was, I just gashed my hands on the concrete beneath. I could still hear them behind me, getting closer and closer, and I walked on my hands and knees until I got across the street and managed to right myself. I was running up the narrow walkway, dashing between the trailers as I saw my faded red one coming into sight. I prayed the stairs wouldn't be icy, and when my foot touched down on the first step, I was rewarded with a groan and the firmness of unfrozen wood. I darted up the steps, crossed the porch, and rammed the key into the lock as I frantically walked into the entryway. I sighed in relief. I was home. And nothing could hurt me here. I turned to slam the door, the screen door not feeling quite firm enough, but my hand stopped. I saw my breath as it came puffing out, and I felt as if it were thicker than usual. There were dozens of footprints in the snow outside my trailer, some in the yard, some on the porch, but all of them led to my front door. It was as if all of those kids had followed me home, each of them beckoning to be let inside so they could come out of the cold. I could just picture a dozen or more half-burnt children, the snow falling on their ruined skin, looking hopefully at me as if just asking for a place by the fire. It was all too much, and when I slammed the door shut, there was a note of finality to it. I made a mental note that night to try and find a new route home, but the situation, it seemed, fixed itself. I was awoken at 6 a.m. the next day by my boss telling me that Dixie, my day manager, had called to tell him that she had quit that morning. Run off with her damn boyfriend, and good riddance, I say. You've been a solid night guy, but I figured I'd offer you a chance to come work days if you wanted. Position comes with an extra $3 an hour, but you'll have to start today. Interested? I was. And the forest seemed a lot less spooky in the daylight. I hadn't encountered any more phantom footprints after that night, but I'll never forget how the ghostly mob chased me home one cold February night. The envelope I found on my desk one Wednesday morning was a deep, rich violet, and the paper was soft, almost leathery when I picked it up. In the always dim light of the newspaper office, I could see the reflective glow of gold foil letters. The text was simple. You're invited. Now, if you're anyone else, this might be a pretty cool thing to find on your desk. Nothing like an invitation to a fancy party or an exclusive club to break up your typical workday. But the sight of this envelope filled me with apprehension. An invitation is never just an invitation in Habitsville, and yet I opened it. Inside was a metallic gold sheet of paper with scrawling, looped writing that read, a guided tour of the Habitsville Heart Museum. Below it was tomorrow's date, and a time, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The Habitsville Heart Museum. I had never heard of such a place. I asked around the office, but everyone seemed just as clueless as I was, even Heather, who covers the arts and culture column. It was seeming more and more like a prank. After all, there was no address on the paper or the envelope. Sort of invitation doesn't include a location, so I let it sit on the corner of my desk the rest of the day. When it came time to close shop, I put it in my jacket pocket and resolved to throw it away once I got home. But like the various wrappers and loose bits of paper that also lived in my pockets, it was forgotten. So there the invitation stayed. I didn't waste time pondering it that night nor the following morning, and by the afternoon of the next day I just forgotten about it entirely. Until around 2:30 p.m., when I began to hear it. Bum, bum. At first I thought the pulse was my own. I was working on a fairly boring story at my desk, practically dozing off, when it settled lightly in my ears. A slight thumping, like a distant drum. I tried to write through it. Maybe I was getting another migraine, or my blood pressure was high. But soon, the rhythm became distracting because of one disturbing fact. This heartbeat didn't match up with my own. It was much heavier, slow, and as I became more anxious, the dissonance between the two speeds grew. I looked around to see if anyone else seemed to be hearing it, but the few other people in the office appeared unbothered. I stood up and walked over to the office door, trying to spot an outdoor concert or a car with a bone-rattling bass, but all appeared quiet out on the street. Although when I moved closer to the door, the beating in my ears grew ever so slightly louder, as though coaxing me forward. I took another glance around the office. There was no suspicious glances turned my way. I could see through the glass that my boss was stuck in another all-day meeting. And so I slipped out the office door. Walking through the streets of Habitsville was a trial and error. As I lurched forward towards the sound, the drumming pulse led me down alleyways and past unfamiliar shops and houses, growing quieter with each wrong turn and louder with every one that got me closer to, well, I wasn't sure what. Eventually, I ended up at an impasse. The beating was at its loudest volume yet, but there was nowhere else to go. I was cornered in a truly decrepit section of town. I half expected tumbleweeds to come rolling by. The drumming in my head had faced me with two unappealing options. On the left was what seemed to be an old hat shop. Not old like the 1950s, old like the 1850s. There were dusty hats stuffed with feathers and taxidermied animals behind the filthy pane of glass. And on the right was an ice cream parlor with a shattered window and a huge novelty discolored cone out front. Neither building had lights on. Both felt supremely haunted. I sighed heavily as the pulsing continued. I leaned to the left, and the sound decreased. I sighed again. Demented, ancient ice cream shop it is. But when I moved to the right, the sound went lower as well. I stared ahead for a moment, confused. It was one thing to be led here by a creepy internal beating heart, but it was another thing for it to be so anticlimactic. And then I saw it. Between the ice cream parlor and the hat shop, there was a sliver of space. It was so slight, too slight to be intended as a well-trodden passageway, and yet, when I took a step towards it, the beating grew louder. I knew I shouldn't go in there. It was just wide enough for me to fit in sideways, that much I could tell, but my brain was adamant that I not attempt to scrape through. No, Sam, please don't squeeze into the tiny dark crevice where your corpse will never be found if you get stuck and die, my brain said. But it would be incredibly out of character if I start listening to my brain now. so I turned sideways and began to shuffle. The space between, to put it plainly, sucked. It was dark, like the sun couldn't reach such a narrow angle, and the brick on my chest and back chilled me through to my lungs. Worse than that was what spread over my hands as I felt my way forward. A viscous fluid that seemed to cover the expanse of the alleyway. The stone scraped against me every time I breathed deeply, and resorted to taking only short, shallow puffs of air. The pulsing in my ears continued, strong and certain, as I traveled through the slime passageway. I couldn't make out what awaited me at the end, only that the darkness gave way to a beam of white light, which, unfortunately, is often what people report seeing right before they die. The alley grew just a bit narrower at the end, so I couldn't turn my head, and had to suck in my stomach and hold my breath until finally I was birthed into a section of Habitsville I had never laid eyes on before. Huge brick walls, probably 40 feet high, surrounded this strange, secluded square. It seemed impossible that I had never noticed it before. Logically, it should be visible from just about every other part of town. There was no break in the brick that I could see besides where I stood after emerging from the crevice, as though the tight alleyway was the only entrance to get in within the brick square. And in the center of it all was the Habitsville Heart Museum. The building was grand in every sense. I'm no architectural expert, but it looked more like a cathedral than a museum, with ornate onion domes and towering twisted spires. It was the most impressive building I had ever seen. And there, engraved on a marble plaque over an elaborate carved oak door, was its title: the Habitsville Heart Museum. I stood there feeling absolutely minuscule in the bizarre alcove, listening hard for the heartbeat to tell me where to go next. It took only a moment for me to realize I had been standing in complete silence. I couldn't catch a single pulsing note on the breeze. "Mr. Singer!" a voice cut through the quiet. I turned away from the magnificent structure before me to see a man emerging from the same slight passage that I had inched through. The man was small, at least smaller than me, with a very neat appearance. A suit, with a scratched, patterned handkerchief in the breast pocket, groomed mustache. But he didn't seem stuffy. His eyes seemed friendly, and I finally felt my shoulders relax. The man walked over, his steps echoing strangely against the brick enclosure. He smiled. "You're early!" "Am I?" I answered, realizing I had taken neither watch nor phone with me from the newspaper office. "I just came when I was, called." It was the smallest allusion to the drumming heartbeat that I dared make, lest the stranger think I was completely insane. But to my surprise, he laughed. "Yes, the museum can get impatient," he said. "Okay, so definitely not the time to relax." I looked from the slight man to the astounding building, and my hands grew cold and clammy. "You mean the pulsing was coming from that?" I asked, nodding toward the great hulking silhouette of the museum. The man chuckled, his mustache wiggling up and down as he did. "We should really walk and talk, Mr. Singer. The museum was anxious to see you, and it's best not to keep it waiting." He took off towards the tall oak door, and I scampered to keep up with him. "The Habitsville Heart Museum is one of the oldest living buildings in Habitsville," he began. And I was already at a loss for words. I couldn't pick which phrase was the most alarming. Living building or one of. "It's a place of artistic achievement and organic intellect. It's also extremely elusive. Only those who've been invited are permitted to go inside. So far, since its opening, that VIP list has included myself. I serve as the curator, and our security staff, and as of a few days ago, you, Mr. Singer." He smiled like I was supposed to feel lucky, but I couldn't even muster a grimace. We'd arrived at the front doors, and suddenly the man stopped. You don't hear the heartbeat anymore, correct?" he inquired, bemused. I listened for a moment, then nodded. It isn't gone. It's simply matched up with your own. That's how you know you're one of the fortunate souls who've arrived at the right place, at the right time, with the museum's blessing. Everyone has the same heartbeat here. He was right. The pulse was gone, but if I was quiet, even held my breath, they could hear it. A second pulse, humming along with my own. The slightest throbbing echo against my ribcage. Right then, the man said before gripping the handle of the door and swinging it open. Let's begin the tour. It was mysteriously magnificent. A domed wooden ceiling painted with intricate Renaissance-style scenes that forked into multiple rounded hallways. Artwork lined the walls of various styles and content. Everything from sweeping landscapes to picturesque pastorals to the bright, bold colors of the abstract. I struggled to take it all in while the curator crossed the stone floors briskly. Right then, I believe we shall start over here, he started, motioning to the tunnel on the far right before I was interrupted. Sir? The meek voice came from a very nervous-looking woman behind the desk in the center of the room. She appeared to be in her 30s, with wildly curly hair stuffed into a cap that read, Security, in large black letters. She had several oversized computer monitors in front of her, but she was looking to the curator with worried eyes. The curator was annoyed. Not now, Kimberly. She shifted behind the desk. But, sir... She tried again, but was cut off. Kimberly, we have a guest, the man hissed through his teeth. The guard looked at him, confused. Then her eyes traveled behind him to see me. She studied my face with an odd, bewildered way, until suddenly her expression shifted to one of excitement. Mr. Singer, she exclaimed, and I wondered if everyone here mysteriously knew my name. We're all very glad you're here. Welcome to the Habitsville Heart Museum. I nodded politely, and she turned back to the curator. I'm sorry, sir, but I really do need a quick word with you. The curator sighed, mustache wiggling with agitation. Fine, but make it quick. He turned to me. My apologies, Mr. Singer. Have a look around the lobby. I'll be back in a moment. Take your time, I said. Politeness seems to be something I fall back on when completely and utterly confused. The two sequestered themselves behind the security desk as I began to stroll around the circular room. I was looking around the lobby. Sure, there was plenty to see in just half this room alone. I couldn't imagine what awaited me in each of the museum's hallways, but I was also, of course, doing my best to eavesdrop on the conversation going on in the center of the room. At first listen, it seemed to revolve around the whereabouts of the missing security guard named Humphrey. He patrolled in respiratory this morning, which was what was on the schedule, Kimberly was whispering nervously as she typed something into the computer. Yes, right? The curator hissed impatiently. And then? Well, he was supposed to go to lunch. He said he was going to lunch, so I said I would cover olfactory. He said he was going to lunch, she repeated. And? The curator demanded. Kimberly, please stop wasting my time. Humphrey went to muscular instead. The room grew deathly quiet. I was standing in front of a painting of a family having a picnic in a meadow, trying my best to seem like staring at art rendered me deaf, though it seemed like this new information was enough to make the two museum staff forget they had a guest. Muscular, the curator repeated, his voice strangled and hoarse. Yes, sir, Kimberly answered, morose. Then she clicked something on the computer. It was silent as the two watched whatever it was on the screen, but it only lasted about 20 seconds, and when it was over, the ringing silence seemed to intensify. Then the curator spoke. Right then. On with the tour. The curator strolled away from the guard behind the desk, whose fear looked not the slightest bit assuaged. He came back to me, smiling, and motioned towards the far wall. Carved into the surface was a darkened archway, the entrance to a tunnel. Above it was a plaque labeled Coronary. It's always best to start with the heart, of the Habitsville Heart Museum. Perhaps this will tell you more about why you're here. Then, the curator stood before the tunnel and crossed into the darkness without hesitation. Like a willingly swallowed sardine into a whale's open mouth. I often wonder, dear readers, if you think me brave, if you've read my stories, read and believed them, then you're used to hearing me justify just why I get myself into the predicaments I do. With all the mysterious creatures, places, and most horribly people that make up this town, you may think me courageous to the point of stupidity, daring to the point of arrogance. But if I was to tell you the truth, I would say that I am a supremely anxious mind, trapped inside an absurdly trusting body. So as I stood in front of this great maw of a hallway, listening to the footsteps of the curator get farther and farther away, my mind pleaded with my body, begging to turn around and leave, and yet my foot moved forward into the shadow, and soon I too was inside the whale. I followed the curator into the coronary tunnel, 2 cells in a vein, and felt myself overcome with the strangest sensation in my chest. My heart was beating harder, not faster. I was afraid my pulse should have been racing, but instead, it held its same steady beat and seemed to compensate by pushing large gulps of blood through my arteries like a little combustion engine in my chest. "What is that?" I asked, unabashedly putting my hand to my torso, horrified to find that I could feel it as well, the outline of the organ inflating and deflating at an alarming capacity. "Nothing to worry about," the curator's voice drifted through the dark calmly. "Completely ordinary," he continued, though the sensation felt anything but. "You're in sync with the museum, which doesn't have much leniency for guests. Stay calm, you'll be fine." My chest actually hurt, with the force of the blood being pushed through my veins, my heart compensating for the museum's slow pulse, and though the panic was sitting as a pit in my throat, I forced myself to take deep breaths. Slowly the pulse returned to normal, and the straining in my chest settled to a dull ache. So bravery was a necessity to survive a trip to the Heart Museum. Not even bravery, a complete and utter apathy to give way to the will of the museum. Though my sight was limited in the dark, my sense of smell wasn't. The odor was growing stronger as we walked, a rotten, dank smell mixed with some chemical, the scent of preservation. Eventually, my nose was burning with the acrid scent, when suddenly the curator's footsteps stopped in front of me, and I too ceased moving through the black. Then 2 sharp claps cut through the quiet, making my body and my heart jump painfully, and suddenly, the lights flashed on. I blinked as my pupils adjusted to the jolt of brightness. What surrounded me was a library of faces. Painted portraits on outstretched canvas covered the surrounding walls, set upon easels under spotlights, and some even were placed flat on the tall ceiling above, eyes staring from every possible direction. They were all sorts of people from all kinds of demographics, and their facial expressions were some of the oddest I'd ever seen. They were like stills from a video, complex contortions of faces captured in oil. Not the usual vacant expressions or soft smiles of other portraits I'd seen. An old woman looked tired, a young boy seemed bored. One woman appeared to be mid-sneeze and another mid-laugh. The hair, makeup, and visible clothing of each person varied in style and time period. I saw boxy glasses from the 40s, long hair from the 70s, and a teenager with headphones on. Though the subjects were odd, even I could tell these paintings were expertly done. If all done by a single artist, to fill the room would have surely taken a lifetime. Beautiful, isn't it? I'd nearly forgotten I wasn't alone. The curator stood in the center of the room, gazing at the portraits. "I've seen them 1,000 times, yet Every encounter, they take my breath away. He smiled at me, and for a moment I actually half returned the expression. So genuine he seemed. I like to start guests off here. Lets them know how welcome they really are. The statement almost seemed sweet, until I really thought about it. The beauty is welcoming, you mean? I asked hesitantly. Well, yes, the curator said, but it's not what I was referring to. I didn't respond, and he turned to me, eyebrows raised as though I had done something he hadn't expected. You surprise me, Mr. Singer. Wait, surely you recognize them? Habitsville isn't that large of a town. I examined the portraits more closely, trying to understand what the curator expected me to see, and then I felt it. Familiarity, but it wasn't until I saw a portrait of my third-grade teacher, Mrs. Devereaux, that I realized what all the portraits had in common. They all depicted the contorted faces of citizens. It might have been charming if the one portrait I'd recognized hadn't been Mrs. Devereaux. We're shielded from so much as children if we're lucky. That's a kind way of putting it. Often I wondered if it was this editing of everyday events that led me down the path of investigative journalism. I can't stand for a secret to be kept. Mrs. Devereaux was one of those secrets. She had been a kind woman in her late 60s, too passionate about teaching to retire, though perhaps that was a sugarcoating too. Though memories were blurry from that age, there was no forgetting the large wire-framed squares she wore for glasses, the lenses so thick they were warped. Her eyes were made comically large, and I always thought she resembled a housefly. I could never swat them after she was gone. A series of stand-in teachers came after Miss Devereaux abruptly stopped coming to class, each telling us a different reason why the woman had disappeared. A long vacation, a bad cold, a visiting relative. Eventually, with the self-centeredness of children, we stopped asking for explanations. Now her portrait stared back at me. Lips hardened into a grim line. Her eyes sad, almost pitying. What is this? I asked, barely letting the question come from my throat. The curator spoke gently. This is how we choose our guests. I tore my eyes away from Mrs. Devereaux's and turned back towards my guide. His eyes mirrored hers, pitying and patient. A teacher talking to a child. I was acutely aware of the pain in my chest as my pulse strained to quicken, held back by the mysterious thrall of the museum. I was always a good student. It took only a moment more for me to understand what he was saying. I walked around the room, eyes darting frantically from frame to frame, the movement making my blood gush loudly, painfully in my ears until, of course, I found it. An ornate gold frame. Orange undertoned oil, so smooth it still looked wet. A young man was pictured holding a white coffee mug with a pine tree on it to his lips. Gaze cast down as though reading a newspaper, or perhaps proofreading an article. I leaned in even closer. Maybe I was mistaken, but I saw the chip in the pottery rim that always threatened to cut my lip. The tiny scar on his brow from a hard childhood fall. It was a painting of me. Mr. Singer. He clearly crooned my name, so sweetly was he calling me. I tore my eyes away from my image on canvas and looked at the curator. How? He sighed and closed the gap between us, resting a hand on my shoulder as we both examined the painting. There's an element of mystery to all art, I suppose, though the museum's work holds more questions than most. I've long since given up wondering how it does what it does. More pertinent now is a different question. Why? The curator had let his simple question linger in the air as we walked through the rest of the gallery. I avoided the gazes of the portraits, trying to keep my heart from fighting the pulse of the museum. And eventually we came to a door on the far side of the hall. A word was engraved above it. Muscular. After the close and cluttered gallery, the muscular department was jarring. A cavernous room with a high domed ceiling. The layout seemed nearly impossible, as though both the lobby and the coronary gallery bottlenecked directly into a hall larger than the building itself. Crucially adding to the eeriness, the room was completely empty. Devoid of windows, and lit only from recessed lights used sparingly. The curator and I's shadows were the only things decorating the walls. "There's nothing here," I said, not knowing if this was a reason to feel relieved or even more concerned. "Looks to be," the curator said, sounding amused. "But looks can be deceiving." He began walking briskly across the floor, footsteps echoing sharply. "Let's walk and talk, Mr. Singer. It's best to move through muscular quickly." I matched his steps and immediately felt the strain on my heart. "Are you sure we shouldn't slow down? If we get our heart rates too high, I don't know what'll happen." "Heart attack, stroke, all sorts of nasty things," the curator answered drolly. "I've made this walk many, many times, I assure you. I'll keep a healthy pace." This did nothing to calm my nerves, but there wasn't much else to do besides trust the curator, at least for the time being. Now would be a great time to start explaining what the hell's going on here. I stopped in my tracks. I was so sick of such useless phrases, such non-answers. To be quite honest, I was just the wrong mixture of scared and pissed off. "I'm sorry. That's not good enough. I want to know what's going on here now." I realize I'm not an especially threatening guy, but I was still surprised when the curator's stride didn't break. Not in the least. "Keep moving, Mr. Singer. It's for the best." His voice drifted back to me. I had had enough. We hadn't gone very far. Surely I could remember the path back into the bizarre coronary gallery. Out of the lobby, squeeze myself back between the hat and the ice cream parlor until I was back into the familiar Habitsville I knew. I was done with mystery and cryptic conversations. It was time to go home. I turned on my heels to head back from where we came, and sharp pain blossomed from my nose. There was nothing before me but red, and as I blinked, I saw, inexplicably, blood smeared on a rust-colored brick wall that seemed to have sprung up out of nowhere. It stretched above 10 feet horizontally, blocked my view of the exit, but otherwise seemed to not have a function. It absolutely had not been there only a moment ago. My one hand cupped to catch the free-flowing blood as it dribbled down my chin. The other reached out and grazed my fingertips against the rough surface of the wall. There was no question. It was real. I could feel the grittiness of the stone as my blood cooled on its surface. "How?" I called to the curator, but as I turned to look ahead to where I could still hear the footsteps of my guide, dread coursed through me. Inches from my face, where before had been an empty hall, was instead a brick wall. Well, part of a brick wall. Impossible as it seemed, the wall appeared to be half done. I could see the binding was still wet, and it only went to my chest instead of over my head as the other one had, as though the crafter had been caught in the act, construction interrupted. "What the hell?" I said, my speech garbled from the blood still flowing from my nostrils. "Keep moving, Mr. Singer," the voice of the curator floating by, almost singing, from much farther than it had been before. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the smallest flint of movement. I turned my head, and there was a new wall, joining the first two, creating a narrow space of only about 2 feet. And in that moment, the mechanisms of this place was clear. Keep moving, or get entombed. I bunched up my shirt by the collar and pinched my nostrils with it. A quick glance to my right told me that another wall had risen up, so the only way to move was forward. I kept my eyes wide open, afraid to blink, and hoisted myself onto the top of the wall. Ironically, I overestimated my own strength and lost my balance, falling from about 10 feet onto the hard marble floor. The blood from my nose spattered across the floor, and for a moment, I thought I had done far worse than a simple broke nose. Blood pooled in front of me on the floor, and my head spun. I could make out the reflection on its smooth surface. No, I garbled. The walls had spread like a virus across the room, each in varying stages of construction. I got to my feet as quickly as I could, my eyes roved over them quickly. It seemed that so long as I kept them locked in my gaze, they were unable to grow. I limped forward, my body sore from the fall. I was able to move around the wall directly in front of me. I was dizzy. Must have hit my head on the floor, and I lurched forward, bracing myself on the large chunk of brick in front of me, fighting to keep my eyes from clenching against the pounding in my head. I had to keep moving forward. I knew this by now, but neither of my injuries nor my urgency could keep me from noticing one terrible fact. This was not a brick. I let out an involuntary, disgusted groan as I drew my hand away sharply. It came away wet. I abandoned my watching of the surrounding walls to examine what I had just incidentally grasped. There, speckled with caulk and squeezed in the center of 4 surrounding stone bricks, was a completely rectangular human head. It had clearly been round at one point, severed at the neck, and molded to fit the space. It had been dead for some time, though, not long enough to lose its flesh. My index finger had perforated its solid cheek, now paper-thin with time. The half-moon eyes yellowed and rotten. It hadn't been done artfully. It didn't even feel meant to scare. Organic bricks made by something that saw flesh as material. Some involuntary instinct within me kept me from getting sick. Survival was my priority, though. I wanted to look away. I kept my eyes roving over the walls as I moved, making eye contact with a large number of head bricks that were shoved amongst the real ones. Looking deeply into the sockets of the ones that already faded to bone. "Where are you?" I called out desperately, becoming disoriented as walls behind walls cropped up. "Keep moving, Mr. Singer," the curator answered to my right. I'd gotten turned around after all. He sounded despicably placid, his calmness infuriating. "Keep talking," I responded. The curator obliged, opting instead for a steady hum of a dissonant melody I didn't recognize. I followed the haunting sound of his tenor, rounding corners and praying that I would have enough space to move forward through the labyrinth. Every time I blinked, it seemed more bricks were added, both flesh and otherwise. The curator was close, so close it seemed as though only one more set of walls separated us. I turned what I hoped was the final corner. A dead end. My stomach dropped. "Wait," I said aloud, but it was futile. By the time I turned, my route back was walled up. I breathed as deeply as I could through my mouth, the air tasting of rust from the blood of my crusted nose. Nonetheless, my heart was hammering, fighting against the rhythm of the museum. I looked to the top of the wall. It was far too tall to make it over, and to my horror, bricks had appeared over top of me, slowly creating a ceiling. I was going to be sealed inside. I started tracing my fingers against the grout of the brick in front of me. The beams from the overhead lights were narrowing as brick upon brick spread above me. I could hear the grinding sound of them being placed, but as I looked up, I could never see the builder. I was clawing at the space between the 2 bricks as the final gap was closed. The curator, still humming his haunting melody, sounded submerged in water. My nails were chipping against the stone, not finding any give and beginning to panic. Then, Then my fingers found something soft. I pressed against it and found the rubbery sensation of buoyant flesh. The sick feeling growing in my stomach. I was thankful there was no light to see what I had to do next. I tried to shove my sore fingers in the grooves between the head and the bricks around it, but it was sealed tight. There would be no gentle shimmying the block out. I reared my fist back and let it hit. It hurt more than I thought that it would. I didn't feel any movement. I took a deep breath, backed up as best I could until my back pressed against the wall behind me. Then I kicked. It helped to picture a jack-o'-lantern. The way I would stomp out the rotting ones as a kid once Halloween had passed. Squelching the guts of a vegetable, and the hard bits hitting the floor just seeds. Merely a pumpkin, and nothing more. Eventually, with a sound of suction and a pop, light filtered back into the confined space that I was trapped in. The curator's humming sounded clear. I continued to knock the bricks surrounding the hole, trying not to see the bits of materials dangling from my shoes. With loud echoing cracks, the bricks fell away, and I could climb through the hole. I breathed heavily, chest aching. The curator stood by another door idly, looking mildly entertained, but otherwise unbothered. His humming had stopped. He glanced down at my feet. He made a sound with his teeth. I looked down too, against my best interests. It immediately diverted my eyes from the pulpy mass that once was a human head. A relatively fresh one, by the looks of it, which made everything so much worse. Poor Humphrey, the curator said, disappointed. Then he stepped swiftly through the door that read, Respiratory. And I, not knowing better than to drag behind, followed suit. We were plunged once more into darkness. The curator and I, my only guide, once again, the echoing sound of his footsteps just ahead of me, strolling confidently. I was tired, emotionally and physically, but I followed dutifully, unwilling to be left to the devices of the museum. It's not good, is it? I could have laughed at the question, as absurd as it seemed in that moment. It's horrible, I answered. The curator let out a sigh as though he was afraid that might be my answer. It wasn't always this way. Finally, I thought I might get some answers. And then I slipped. I thought my feet were sliding due to the residue of Humphrey's head on my sneakers, but as I lost my footing entirely and my hands made contact with the floor, I realized I was very wrong. The first thing I noticed was how moist it was. Not like something had spilled as my hands pressed into it. There was give, and more liquid seeped up between my fingers. I stood up carefully, trying to steady myself on the slippery surface. I could feel the wet patches on my pants where my knees had made contact. I hadn't noticed until then, but the air in this darkened hallway was stale, foul and hot, and there seemed to be a constant breeze blowing against us. So we were walking against the wind. And if I had held very, very still, I could feel it. A slight rhythmic rising and falling like the swinging of a ship. Respiratory. I couldn't see it, but I knew what surrounded the curator and I. The warm, wet, bronchial flesh of lungs, expanding and contracting to match the breath of a beast, of a creature. You all right? The curator's voice asked, some feet ahead of me. I didn't know how to even begin to answer the question. Respiratory takes some getting used to, but it gives us a nice time to chat. A nice time. What the hell's going on here? Why am I here? Why? This used to be a lovely place, Mr. Singer. Breaks my heart what happened to it. And thus, the curator finally began to tell me the sorry tale of the Habitsville Heart Museum. Long ago, the Habitsville Heart Museum sat where it was meant to, in the center of Habitsville, back when the shops this side of town were a main street, bustling with activity. The Habitsville Heart Museum was a popular spot for visitors back when strangers came into town and were welcomed in. Before Habitsville became what it is. The curator isn't sure what happened, or if there was any one cause, but gradually the businesses around the museum started closing down. The ice cream parlor, the hat shop, and the number of boarded-up shacks I passed on my way to the square where the museum now resides. The town grew, but it grew inwards. Visitors no longer stumbled into town, and the permanent residents no longer wanted to be close to Habitsville history. In fact, they seemed to want to know as little about the town as possible. The built bakeries and tailors and groceries, newspaper offices, as a shell around the old main street around the museum. A living tomb. It makes sense to me now, but when the curator first told me, I wasn't especially receptive. You're joking, right? You're telling me that everything, the missing people's portraits, the brick walls, and who knows what else in this place, it's all because the museum's business has been down. The museum is lonely, Mr. Singer. And when a creature of its age and nature is upset, it lashes out. He explained away the carnage like a parent making excuses for a poorly behaved child. The sticky wind continued to wail against my face, tasting rotten in my mouth and burning my nose. Okay. Fine, it's lonely. What am I supposed to do about it? I'm an old man, Mr. Singer. The curator's voice drifted back to me. I have no children, no living heirs, no one I trust. I haven't a soul to leave the museum to when I'm gone, and it requires very specific care. It took only a moment for me to understand what he was saying. Surely you're not asking me to take your place. The curator's voice was steady, firm, nearing parental with me too. I'm not asking, Samuel. This is something you must do. For the good of Habitsville. The museum needs visitors. At that, I stopped walking. Surely he wasn't saying what I thought he was. I can't bring people here. This thing will tear them apart. This time, the curator's footsteps stopped with mine. It's tear apart a person here or there, or tear apart the town, Samuel. What you've seen here today has been difficult for you, I know. But I assure you, it is nothing compared to what the museum can do. It gives us a gift with this restraint. Don't take it for granted. Dread built in my chest, but something else too. An aching sadness. This was a responsibility I didn't ask for, but was it one I could turn away from? The sensation in my chest built, the back of my throat constricting. I won't do it, I said. But my voice sounded strangled and cracked. The sadness intensified, my lower lip trembled. Was I about to... Suddenly, my abrupt melancholy was interrupted by the sensation of falling. I fell to my knees again, and I heard a similar splash, as the curator must have also hit the slick surface of the hall. He cursed as the floor rose again. Not gradually, but in a sharp movement upwards before shuddering back over and over again. The breath through the tunnel picked up as well, whistling dissonant tones over one another in a haunting drone. Over the din, the curator's voice shouted at me. I hope you're happy. It's crying. The journey to the far end of the respiratory department was a daunting one, and by the end, both the curator and I was soaked to the bone in pneumatic fluid. and dizzy from being tossed around by the museum's sobs. But eventually we did reach a door at the end of the tunnel, and my eyes immediately flitted to the plaque above it, nailed into the fleshy wall. Neurological. We paused for just a moment before the door. The sadness in my chest was subsiding into a dull ache, and the spasm of the tunnel was only slight tremors. We moved through emotions and approached logic. The curator said quietly, "I suggest you do the same, Mr. Singer." I only glared at him. He had to know there was nothing logical about this. But I didn't stop him as he opened the door, and we both stepped through. The room, if I could call it a room, was a vignette. Its edges were murky, rippling in thick darkness, indiscernible. It could have been the size of a closet or a parking lot. There was no way to know. The curator stepped in confidently, hands clasped neatly behind his back. He walked forward under the single light that hung from the ceiling, a cage-white light bulb larger than any I'd ever seen, even in street lamps. It flickered and made a light zapping sound each time the light spiked. I kept expecting to see the edges of the room, furniture, or anything, but even the surges of electricity revealed nothing. "Stay there, Mr. Singer," the curator spoke as he walked, and I stopped. He walked only a few more feet, and as he did, the darkness rescinded. Not like fog dissipating, like a thousand thick tendrils tangled together, sinking back into the sea. They crept back in time with the curator's steps until finally an object was uncovered. "Do you paint much, Sam?" The curator stood in front of a canvas suspended on an easel. Brushes rested on the ledge. "No, not really," I stammered. "Maybe a bit when I was a kid. My mother liked to paint." The curator turned back to face me, a wistful smile on his face. "Really? So did mine." He turned back to the canvas, letting his finger trace along the edge. His smile fell. "I do hope you can help the museum, Sam." He turned to me, the zapping of the light bulb overhead illuminating his face ghoulishly, the shadows dancing harshly against the lines of his face. "I told you I can't," I started to say, but the curator just shook his head, oddly peaceful. "Please, if we could just get out of here, maybe once we're outside, we could find a way." "You're pleading with me like I'm your captor, Sam. We're merely two ships weathering the same storm. The sea doesn't bargain." As he spoke, I could feel it, the beating in my chest starting to quicken. At first, it was a relief, the pace of the pulse finally fitting more accurately to my own, not fighting against it just for a moment, but then it quickly surpassed the realm of comfort. It was hammering against my ribs, and I knew the curator could feel it too because we were doubling over at once, hands clutching our chests. I've never had a heart attack. I'm young enough to have the luxury of not giving them much thought. But this is how I imagine it to feel, a rodent running wild in your ribcage, flurried and reckless, pulling at individual arteries, digging a home in your heart's chambers. The large light bulb over the canvas began to flicker even brighter as the curator and I fell to the floor, gasping for air. My vision began to blur, and I could see at the edge of the light there was nothing. Beyond the darkness and the flickers of lightning, there seemed to be nothing but swirling black in the room. Perhaps nothing but darkness awaited me at all. The curator's twisted face came in and out of focus, thrashing violently, saliva dripping down his cheeks and chin and pooling on the floor. A desperate, animalistic expression on his face. His lips were pulsing and sputtering the same choking sound over and over, a sort of spit flecking with each utterance. I shut my eyes. I didn't want that to be the last thing I saw. And then the moment eased. Sore and raw, my heart began to settle back into a survivable rhythm. I left my eyes closed as it settled, in case the sense of relief was merely death. But eventually I felt the ache radiating through my chest, and I knew this couldn't be death. Surely this pain didn't follow me to the other side. So I opened my eyes. Everything was as it had been. The darkness still rippled at the edge of the room. The light bulb overhead buzzing steadily, its light shining down on the blank canvas and brushes. And the curator. I knew from a distance that he was too still. When my eyes were able to focus, I could see that his jaw was slack, no longer sputtering. His eyes still open. There were red blood vessels having broken from the pressure of his pulse. I wondered absently if mine looked the same. I crawled over to him, still weak and trembling violently. "Hey," I choked, my voice barely a whisper. I shook him gently. "Hey." "Hey," I repeated stupidly. I realized I didn't know the man's name. His head rolled loosely, but I knew it wouldn't be long before rigor mortis kicked in. The curator was dead. The curator's corpse stared at me. "What now?" I asked it quietly, with no answer, of course. I looked around the room at the rippling corners of what I could see. "What now?" I asked louder, a bit of anger seeping in past the numbness. "What do you want now?" I yelled at the museum, my voice echoing. The light bulb overhead buzzed loudly, the illumination bringing my attention once more to the canvas in the corner of the room. Puh, puh, puh. Perhaps the curator's final sputters weren't the nonsense of a dying man. This was a guided tour, after all. He managed to get out one last direction before his life's work killed him. It took everything I had to stand up. I staggered forward, closing the distance between myself and the easel. I dragged one foot, then another, over the body of the curator. I studied myself on the wood of the frame and looked at the tools before me. Blank canvas, a medium-tipped brush. A choked laugh surprised me when it emerged from my throat. "There's no paint," I muttered. Then louder, "There's no paint!" I laughed more, a spastic nature hurting my already burning chest. The curator was dead. I was soaked with slowly dying pneumatic fluid. I had to create a piece of art to appease a sentient museum. The thing hadn't given me anything to work with. At that moment, it was the funniest thing I'd ever heard. A sound broke me from my delirium. It was scraping sounds from somewhere deep in the surrounding blackness. As I watched, something emerged from the swirling murk, grounding me painfully back in the reality of my situation. It was a hand. Well, it was a series of hands, clasping onto one another to form a long string. Though it only appeared in a quick burst, I could see that the entire length of it was at least 10 feet. And the hands were all varying stages of decay. Some only bone, some were mottled flesh. The one on the very end was relatively fresh. I could see the veins connecting to nothing. Flex as the structure came sweeping forward and clasped itself around the curator's ankle. I said nothing. Did nothing. As a long tail of limbs dragged the body of the curator into the darkness beyond like a beast, bringing prey back to its den. I suddenly felt quite small. There was nothing to hide within the aura of the light overhead, and I couldn't possibly run into the darkness. Especially after that, I was frozen. A sitting duck. From the depths there were noises, cracking, wet slaps and tearing, grinding, squelches and splatters. I couldn't say the words, hear what it was to hear those sounds. But I can say that when it stopped, mercifully stopped, the scraping of the hands came again. This time from my left, I braced myself to feel my weight being pulled out from under me, a grip around my ankle. You may call me a coward, but I shut my eyes again. And then I heard the slithering recede. I opened one eye, then another. The hands were nowhere to be seen, and I realized what it had been doing. It was giving me paint. Before me was a simple palette, wooden like the easel, containing several shades color. They were earth tones, all scarlet, burnt orange, and clay. I could tell the brightest red was pure blood. The white ground bone and marrow fragments floating to the top. I picked up the palette, my hands trembling violently. The whiff of rotten rust burned my nostrils along with a strong, acrid scent coming from the yellow. Stomach bile, I assumed. And a sort of salt and pepper brown mixed with a clear, viscous fluid in a shade I recognized. I looked back to the spot on the floor where the curator's body had lain. Vomit bit at the back of my throat. I couldn't let myself think about what exactly had happened in the darkness beyond. Instead, I picked up the palette, holding it far away from my face, and then picked up the brush. I stood in front of the blank canvas. The tendrils of black rippled around me, and I could feel my heart rate quicken. The museum was excited. So I began to paint. I'm not much of an artist. As a journalist, I create pictures with words. I knew whatever the museum wanted, it wasn't going to be the best approximation of a classic landscape. Something technical, intellectual, though. This was the Neurological Division. This is the Habitsville Heart Museum. So I painted from my bruised, aching heart. I don't recall how much time passed. The paint wasn't very cooperative, bits of hair and bone shard getting embedded into the canvas. The bile took ages to dry, but eventually a picture took shape. Technically abysmal. Yet when I finally stepped back and revealed my work, I felt my pulse finally settle. I could feel the curiosity of the museum peak, and then it settled into something else. It almost felt like when I cried in the respiratory, but different. This was a longing, yearning sort of sadness. I painted a memory. It seemed fitting for the neurological department. I was sitting at the kitchen table, a paper before me, cheap paint scattered about. I had it all over my fingers, my brow furrowed in concentration as I painted. The son in the corner of my work, my mother behind me, looking over my shoulder. A soft smile on her face. I couldn't be certain, but I believe that's the last time I remember painting. I used to really enjoy painting, I said to the darkness, uncertain. I'm not sure why I stopped. The darkness rippled, the emotion undetectable, and then something unexpected happened. About 15 feet away, a light turned on. At first I was frightened, though I hated the darkness around me. What horrors could illumination reveal? But as I looked, I was surprised. I began to walk gingerly towards the newly spotted light. As I approached, I could see there were paintings, not portraits, from the first room that I had entered with the curator. These were snapshots of random expressions, and the smell of rot and flesh was drifted from each canvas. They were depictions of a Habitsville I had never seen before. Bright, happy, charming cobblestone streets, children peering in shop windows, and so many that I recognized as being inside the museum. One in particular, right below the hanging light bulb above, as though given a spotlight just for me to see. A woman, holding her child up to see the art displayed on the museum wall. I gazed at these for a while, taking them all in, and then, with a brief buzz, another light came on. This time, back behind me, past the canvas, on the far side of the room. Under that illumination, I found more paintings in the same style, painted by the same hand, with the same type of subject. Nostalgic content, bustling, joyful. We continued like this, the museum and I, lights turning on one by one until the entire room, a huge grand hall, was lit in bright light. And the museum's art was revealed. I examined the final painting with care, then looked around the room, aghast with what I was seeing. These, I paused, speaking carefully, these are lovely. I could feel the museum's pride bubbling up within me, my heart beating with a little more strength. I decided to push my luck a bit further. It's a shame no one gets to see them. That too, I felt in the museum's emotions. A sadness weighing the both of us down. What you've painted here, it's not really what Habitsville is anymore, I said. I felt the museum's mood dip even further. It's changed a bit out there. It seems like maybe you've been away for a while. An even sharper dip in mood. I could feel anger stirring beneath my own skin, tears biting at the corner of my eyes. Maybe it's time you came back. I said it tentatively, nearly holding my breath. I knew what I was saying was insane, that I should be cursing the museum and all of its horrors, using every spare moment for escape, but the sharing of our heartbeats revealed in me an empathy I didn't know I had. I could feel the complexity of this creature, how bitter its loneliness. The museum had paused as though considering what I was suggesting. Then the entire building tilted. The breathing was knocking from my lungs as I was flung across the room, colliding hard with the sharp corners of canvases and frames. I was being thrown about violently in a rhythmic torrent of movement, right to left and back. I knew better than to think it an earthquake. An ornate wooden frame cracked beneath my chin, blood seeping from a new wound and spattering against the paintings closest to me, adding red poppies to rolling fields, roses to gardens, and then as quickly as it began, the movement ceased. I sat up, emerging from the pile of art. Despite the harsh rocking, the majority of it was unharmed. I held the collar of my shirt against the wound on my chin to stop the bleeding and looked around. There, on the far corner of the room, the last corner to be illuminated, was a staircase. I climbed quickly over the scattered art, careful not to damage any as I went. I reached the stairs and climbed up them, taking one last look at the chaos below. Knowing that somewhere, buried beneath the others, was my own piece. Mine and the curator's. At the top of the staircase was a door with a plate above it. Lobby. I could have cried. I pushed open the door, and there I was, back where I had begun. It was disheveled now, much of the art fallen off the walls, sculptures shattered into chunks on the floor. In the center, the security system had also been turned to ruins. Monitors toppled over, displaying nothing but static. A head popped up behind the desk. Kimberly, the security guard, her wild hair no longer contained beneath a cap, a bruise on her cheek. "Has something happened?" she asked. I didn't know how to answer. She looked around and then back at me. "Where's the curator?" I didn't know how to answer that either. Instead, I walked towards the large oak desk at the front of the building, my heart thrumming in my chest at a steady pace. Neither too fast nor too slow, I wondered if I'd finally regained my freedom, or if I perhaps now felt as the museum did, in harmony. I pulled open the door. I took a few slow steps out and was immediately assaulted with a sound I hadn't expected. People. There was a crowd of people around the building, staring amazed at the museum. It took a few moments for me to realize we were no longer in the secluded square, past the hat shop and the ice cream parlor encased in brick walls. The museum, incredibly, impossibly, had moved. Well, not just moved, but settled itself right on Habitsville's main strip. I took a few more steps out. Another thing became clear to me. The museum hadn't waited for a vacancy to open up in the street. Instead, it had planted itself directly onto another building. If memory served, it was an apartment complex. Rubble surrounded the edges of the museum, and blood seeped out from its foundation. And yet, my heart soared. I felt elated. No longer was the museum trapped within these brick walls. No longer did it only have its own twisted heart for company. There were people. People. A rhythm filled the street as the hearts of Habitsville's citizens settled into one pulse. And one by one, the people entered the Habitsville Heart Museum. It had straightened itself up instantaneously, tidied the wreckage of the move. I watched as the citizens of Habitsville roamed the lobby, speculated as the first few chose their passages, some to respiratory, to muscular, circulatory. I wasn't frightened for them. The museum's rage, its fear, its loneliness, it was gone. There in the center of the lobby, protected with velvet rope, was a familiar piece. Mine. Of a boy painting with his mother. I walked over to it. It had been varnished with some kind of shining chemical, and the stench of death no longer hung around it. A piece of admiration for the curator. There were footsteps beside me. "I can't see," the small voice said. "Hold on," a woman's voice answered. It was a young mother, chasing after a boy who had scampered into the museum. He had stopped before my painting, standing on his tiptoes, trying to see. His mother approached, swept him up into her arms. "There," she said lovingly. "Do you see now?" I saw. And I would continue to see as I visited the Habits Heart Museum whenever I could. There were new pieces constantly. Depictions of modern-day Habitsville mixed in with the paintings of a forgotten town. And sometimes, if I was feeling creative or lonely, or any of those things, I could go to the very heart of the Habitsville Heart Museum. To the room and coronary that was closed to the public, that was once filled with hundreds of rotting portraits. Then I would find a canvas there, and brushes, and paint, real paint. And I would put the colors to canvas. And I would think of the curator. Think of his mother. Think of mine. The only sound, 1,000 hearts beating as one. Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I want to tell you thank you so much for watching tonight's video. I want to give a huge thank you to everybody who supports me on Patreon. This past year has been rough. I've been gone for quite a while trying to get things organized for my own life, and Patreon subscribers, you guys who subscribe everywhere, this has kept me afloat in turbulent waters. So I want to give a very special thank you to Jordan Humble, Diana Kraus, Disciple, Strategy Wolf Emoji, SullyMan, Brandon Mendoza, BrimstonePandemonium, Caltuna, William Wellington, Scruffy the Janitor, Brenna, LaQueda Canizales, Smiley the Psychotic, Jjenna, Dante Kinkade, SimbasBloodyMojo, Mephistopheles, CursepoxPrimarch, M, Jesus Cornejo, Yarghoul, VerbalHorror, Amber Clark, Kearns, Mike, himbojerry, CrusaderChocobo, Corbin Dallas, Estebean, Seclude, Salty Surprise, Red Shadowcat, Turtleman, Cryolinian, Mr. Marcus Blitz, Dirt Diver 030, Voice of Sand, Psychomel, Melted Lake, Tali Sue, William King, Sashi Suzaku, Croconut 509, Stricken, Freddy Krueger, Hades Nephew, Acid System, Sky Harbor, Nico Kyle, The Ginger Bros, Aaron Stormcrow, Daniel Polson, and Corey Kenshin. To all you guys and everybody who's included in the description down below, thank you so much for everything that you guys have done for me, and thank you so much for being here when times get difficult and I can't always be around to make content. I really appreciate your support, and I cannot thank you enough. And that goes to everybody who watches these videos, that goes to everybody who's subbed here, and anybody who has ever liked a creepypasta story ever. I wish you all the best. Sweet dreams.